in the shadowy halls of Aachen's grand palace, where the echoes of ancient conquests still whispered through the stone walls, Emperor Charlemagne sat upon his throne one cold winter evening in the year 813 AD. His once mighty frame now bent with age, but his eyes burning with the fire of a warrior king who had united much of Europe under his iron rule. From the rolling hills of France to the rugged mountains of Italy and the dense forests of Germany, forging an empire that stretched like a vast tapestry woven from battles won and kingdoms subdued, yet as the flickering torchlight danced across the faces of his gathered heirs, his sons and grandsons, each one a potential successor vying for power in the intricate web of Frankish politics, a dark premonition gripped his heart, for he had begun to notice strange signs that hinted at foul play lurking in the corners of his court. Signs that would soon unravel into a mystery of betrayal, poison, and hidden agendas that threatened to tear apart everything he had built over decades of relentless campaigning and wise governance, starting with the sudden illness of his eldest son, Charles the Younger, who had been hale and hearty just weeks before during a hunting expedition in the Ardennes forest where they had chased wild boars through misty dawn mists, laughing and sharing tales of glory, but now lay pale and feverish in his chambers, muttering deliriously about shadows that followed him and a bitter taste in his wine that no one else seemed to detect, prompting Charlemagne to summon his most trusted advisors, including the scholarly monk Alcuin who had come from distant York to educate the royal family in matters of theology and strategy, and the fierce warrior counts who guarded the borders against Saxon rebels and Viking raiders from the north, all of whom gathered in a tense council under the vaulted ceilings adorned with frescoes of biblical heroes and pagan myths blended in the unique Carolingian style, debating whether this was merely a natural ailment brought on by the harsh climate or something more sinister, perhaps a curse from the old gods that Charlemagne had suppressed in his zeal to spread Christianity across his lands, converting temples into churches and forcing baptisms upon reluctant tribes, or worse, a plot hatched by envious rivals within his own bloodline. For the empire was vast and the throne a prize that could tempt even the closest kin to treachery, as whispers circulated about Louis the Pious, Charlemagne's only surviving legitimate son after the deaths of his brothers Pepin the Hunchback and Carloman in earlier years under circumstances that were never fully explained, Pepin accused of rebellion and imprisoned until his untimely end, and Carloman retiring to a monastery only to die shortly after, leaving tongues wagging about possible fratricide or paternal intervention to clear the path for a unified succession, now positioned as the primary heir but facing competition from his own nephews and half-brothers born of Charlemagne's multiple marriages and liaisons, including the ambitious Bernard of Italy, grandson through an illegitimate line, who had been granted the sub-kingdom of Italy and eyed the imperial crown with hungry eyes, plotting alliances with Lombard nobles who still resented Frankish overlordship. And then there was Lothair, Louis's own son, a boy of promise but already showing signs of restlessness in the courtly games of influence, where alliances shifted like sands in the desert campaigns Charlemagne had once led against the Saracens in Spain, failing at Roncesvalles but learning lessons that hardened his resolve, much like the current enigma that began to unfold when a servant girl, wide-eyed and trembling, approached the emperor in secret after midnight, her voice barely above a whisper as she revealed she had overheard a clandestine meeting in the palace gardens under the cover of a moonless night, where hooded figures spoke of removing obstacles to the throne and mentioned a rare herb from the eastern trade routes, brought by merchants from Byzantium who traded silks and spices for Frankish horses and iron, an herb known for its healing properties but deadly in high doses, capable of mimicking the symptoms of a wasting disease that no physician could cure. And as Charlemagne pressed her for more details, her description matched that of a trusted chamberlain who had served the family for years but whose loyalty might have been bought by promises of land and title in a post-Charlemagne world, a world that seemed increasingly precarious as reports trickled in from distant outposts about unrest among the vassals, with Slavic tribes stirring on the eastern frontiers and Moorish incursions testing the southern borders, all while the internal rot of suspicion festered like an untreated wound, leading the emperor to order discreet investigations by his missi dominici, the royal envoys who roamed the empire enforcing justice and collecting taxes, but even they returned with puzzling findings, missing records from the palace apothecary, where vials of potions were unaccounted for, and a series of minor accidents befalling those close to the heirs, such as a stable hand trampled by a spooked horse that had been fed unusual fodder, or a cook falling ill after tasting a dish meant for the royal table. Each incident isolated but together forming a pattern that pointed to a mastermind. Pulling strings from the shadows, perhaps someone with knowledge of alchemy passed down from the Roman era, blending science and sorcery in ways that defied the Church's teachings, which Charlemagne had championed by hosting councils at Aachen to standardize liturgy and combat heresies like adoptionism. Yet now those very religious tensions might be fueling the conspiracy, with bishops and abbots who benefited from imperial grants possibly resenting the heir's secular leanings or favoring one branch over another to secure their monasteries' futures. As the empire's wealth flowed from tithes and tolls along the Rhine and Danube rivers that carry not just goods but secrets and spies, including envoys from the Byzantine court who viewed Charlemagne's imperial title, bestowed by Pope Leo III on Christmas Day 800 in Rome's St. Peter's Basilica amid cheers and acclamations, as a usurpation of their own emperor's authority, and might seek to destabilize the Frankish realm through intrigue, offering gold to disloyal courtiers or smuggling in assassins disguised as pilgrims on the roads to Compostela, roads that Charlemagne had secured against bandits, but now seemed haunted by unseen threats. And as the emperor pondered these possibilities late into the night, staring at the intricate mosaic floor depicting scenes from his victories over the Avars and their ring forts laden with treasure that had filled his coffers, he felt a chill not from the drafty halls but from the realization that the greatest danger might come from within his own family tree, branched and tangled like the ancient oaks in the Teutoburg forest where Roman legions had perished centuries before, a forest he had traversed in his campaigns to avenge those defeats and incorporate the Germanic peoples into his domain, teaching them the benefits of Roman law revived under Carolingian reforms, including the capitularies that dictated everything from agricultural practices to military service. Yet, even those laws could not prevent the human vices of greed and ambition that now appeared to be claiming his heirs one by one, beginning with Charles the Younger's worsening condition, his skin turning sallow and his breaths labored as healers applied leeches and prayed over relics of saints, but to no avail, forcing Charlemagne to confront the possibility of a poisoned lineage, a curse that echoed the biblical tales of Cain and Abel or the Greek tragedies of Oedipus that Alcuin had translated. For the palace school, where young nobles learned rhetoric and arithmetic alongside the heirs, perhaps breeding jealousies that simmered beneath polite debates, and as dawn broke over the palace, painting the sky in hues of red like blood spilled on battlefields from Pavia to Verdun, the emperor resolved to uncover the truth, summoning his most loyal knight, a scarred veteran named Roland who had fought at his side in the Pyrenees, and whose horn blasts at Roncesvalles had become legend, though the Regard massacre there had cost dear friends and taught the folly of overconfidence. Now tasking Roland with shadowing the suspects discreetly, from the opulent chambers of the heirs to the humble quarters of the servants, where gossip flowed freer than ale at feasts that had once celebrated triumphs but now felt ominous, with every goblet potentially laced with death. And as Roland began his vigil, he noticed a peculiar amulet worn by one of the ladies-in-waiting, a symbol that resembled those from the old pagan cults Charlemagne had stamped out, hinting at a revival of forbidden rituals aimed at cursing the bloodline, or perhaps a red herring planted to mislead, for the web of deceit grew thicker with each passing hour, entwining politics, religion, and personal vendettas in a knot that would take cunning to untie. And just as Charlemagne prepared to announce a grand assembly to address the court, a messenger burst into the throne room, out of breath and dust-covered from a hard ride, bearing news that another heir, Pepin of Italy, had fallen gravely ill in his Lombard palace, complaining of the same mysterious symptoms, cramps, visions, and a thirst that no water could quench, sending shockwaves through the assembly and confirming the emperor's worst fears that this was no coincidence but a systematic elimination, orchestrated by an unknown hand that struck from afar, using couriers or birds to deliver tainted gifts, like the exotic fruits from Arab traders that had arrived recently, or perhaps through the very bread baked in the palace ovens, contaminated by an insider with access to all. And as panic began to stir among the nobles, Charlemagne stood tall, his voice booming like thunder over the Elbe where he had baptized thousands, declaring that he would root out the traitor no matter the cost, even if it meant dividing his empire prematurely among the survivors to flush out the ambitious, a risky gambit that could spark civil war but might reveal the culprit's desperation. Yet before he could elaborate, a sudden cry echoed from the adjoining corridor, where a guard had discovered a hidden vial tucked behind a tapestry depicting the Tree of Life, a vial emitting a faint, acrid smell that matched descriptions of the deadly herb. And as they examined it, fingerprints still fresh on the glass. The Emperor's gaze hardened, knowing that the hunt for the poisoner had just begun in earnest. But who could it be? The envious brother, the scheming nephew, the foreign spy, or someone closer, like a betrayed wife from his many unions, harboring grudges over neglected children, for Charlemagne's personal life was as complex as his empire. With queens like Hildegard and Fastrada bearing heirs amid rumors of infidelity, and courtly dramas that rivaled the epics sung by bards at banquets, epics that now seemed pale compared to the unfolding reality. And as the day wore on, with physicians rushing to and fro and prayers rising from the chapel where the Emperor's own tomb was being prepared in anticipation of his mortality, though he was still vigorous enough to ride into battle if needed, the mystery deepened when a cryptic note was found slipped under Charles the Younger's pillow, written in a hand that mimicked ancient runes but decipherable as a warning. "The blood of the father shall not save the sons," a phrase that chilled all who read it, evoking prophecies from seers in the distant past, seers whom Charlemagne had consulted during his coronation, foretelling glory but also division, and now those words seemed prophetic as the heir's fates hung in the balance, compelling the Emperor to delve into forgotten archives in the palace library, filled with scrolls from Constantinople and Baghdad, seeking clues about antidotes or similar plots in history, like the poisonings in the court of Nero or the Byzantine intrigues of Empress Irene, who had blinded her own son to seize power, a parallel that made Charlemagne wonder if a woman in his midst harbored such ruthless ambition, perhaps one of the concubines or a noble lady married to an heir, positioning her offspring for advantage. And as night fell once more, with guards doubled and food tasters employed for every meal, the Emperor retired to his chambers, but sleep eluded him, his mind racing through suspects and motives, from territorial disputes over Aquitaine and Bavaria, subkingdoms granted to sons who now lay vulnerable, to religious fanaticism from monks who saw the heirs as too worldly, advocating for a theocratic rule that Charlemagne had balanced with secular authority. And just as he drifted into uneasy slumber, a soft knock at the door roused him, revealing Alcuin with a grave expression, holding a tome that detailed a rare poison from the Orient, one that left no trace but for the victims' hallucinations of ghostly figures from their past, figures like fallen comrades or wronged enemies. And as they discussed this, a scream pierced the silence from across the palace, drawing them to rush toward the source, where they found another servant collapsed, clutching his throat and gasping about a cloaked intruder who had vanished into the labyrinthine passages built during the palace's expansion. Passages that hid secrets as old as the Roman ruins upon which Aachen stood. Once a spa town favored by emperors before him, now a fortress of intrigue where every shadow could conceal a dagger or a vial, and in that moment, Charlemagne realized the scope of the conspiracy extended beyond his heirs to anyone who might uncover it, making trust a rare commodity in a court once united by loyalty, now fractured by fear. And as the investigation intensified, with Roland interrogating witnesses under torchlight in the dungeons, extracting confessions of minor thefts but no admissions of murder, the Emperor pondered calling upon allies from afar, like the Anglo-Saxon kings or the Abbasid Caliph Harun al-Rashid, who had sent him an elephant as a gift years ago, symbolizing exotic alliances that could provide exotic cures. But time was short, for Charles the Younger's condition deteriorated rapidly, his last words a murmur about a betrayal from within the family circle, leaving Charlemagne to vow vengeance as he held his son's hand, the weight of empire pressing heavier than ever. And as the first part of this tale concludes on that tense note, the mystery only beginning to unfold in the heart of the Carolingian Renaissance, where art and learning flourished amid the peril, setting the stage for revelations that would shake the foundations of power, as Emperor Charlemagne, his beard now streaked with more silver than gold from the weight of years and worries, paced the length of his private study in the Aachen Palace, a room filled with maps of his vast empire unrolled on oak tables, marked with pins representing armies and allies from the Breton marches to the Bohemian frontiers, where Slavic chieftains paid tribute in furs and amber but harbored secret resentments against Frankish overlords who had imposed tolls on their trade routes along the Elbe and Oder rivers. Routes that carried not just goods but rumors of discontent that now seemed intertwined with the poisonings plaguing his family. And as he stared at the flickering candlelight casting long shadows on the parchment. His mind raced back to the cryptic note found under his son's pillow, its runes reminiscent of those carved on ancient standing stones in the Saxon lands he had conquered after the bloody massacre at Verdun, where thousands had been executed for rebellion against his Christianizing efforts. Efforts that had earned him the title of Defender of the Faith from the Pope, but also enemies among those who clung to Odin and Thor in hidden groves. Perhaps seeking revenge through occult means that blended pagan spells with alchemical toxins smuggled from the markets of Venice, where Byzantine and Arab merchants mingled, exchanging secrets of science and sorcery that could fell a man without a trace. And just then, Roland burst into the room, his armor clinking softly despite his attempt at stealth, his face etched with urgency from the night's pursuits through the palace's underbelly, where he had followed a suspicious figure slipping through servant passages that led to the kitchens and cellars stocked with barrels of Rhine wine and sacks of grain from fertile Frankish fields that fed an empire but now might harbor contaminated harvests if the plot extended to sabotaging the food supply. And Roland reported in a low voice that he had overheard a whispered conversation between two guards, one of whom mentioned a delivery of herbs from a cloaked traveler who arrived at the gates under the guise of a pilgrim returning from Rome, carrying indulgences blessed by the Pope but possibly concealing vials in hidden compartments of his staff, a staff adorned with carvings that matched the amulet seen on the lady-in-waiting, suggesting a network of conspirators linked by symbols of the old faith. And as Charlemagne listened, his fist clenched around the hilt of his sword Joyeuse, forged from Damascus steel and said to change color when enemies were near. A legend he half believed in moments like this when betrayal scented the air like smoke from distant campfires of his youthful campaigns against the Lombards in Italy, where he had besieged Pavia for months until King Desiderius surrendered, allowing Charlemagne to claim the Iron Crown and extend his rule southward. But now that Italian domain under Bernard seemed vulnerable, with Pepin of Italy's illness mirroring Charles the Younger's, prompting the emperor to dispatch a swift rider to Verona with orders for Bernard to secure the passes over the Alps and quarantine any suspicious arrivals from the south, where Norman pirates raided coasts and Saracen fleets threatened Sicily, alliances that might be exploited by foreign powers envious of Carolingian might, such as the Umayyad emirs in Córdoba who remembered the defeat at Poitiers by Charlemagne's grandfather Charles Martel, the hammer who had halted the Muslim advance into Europe. A legacy that Charlemagne upheld but now felt slipping as internal rot weakened the hammer's strike, and as the discussion deepened, Alcuin joined them, his robes dusty from poring over manuscripts in the scriptorium where monks copied Virgil and Augustine under his guidance, fostering a renaissance of learning that illuminated the Dark Ages with illuminated texts bound in jeweled covers, and he presented a decoded message from the note, revealing it as a variation of Ogham script used by Irish monks who had fled Viking raids to seek refuge in Frankish courts, suggesting the involvement of a learned cleric dissatisfied with the emperor's policies on church lands, perhaps one who favored Louis the Pious for his devout nature over the more martial heirs like Charles, who preferred the saddle to the altar. A journey through vineyards and villages where peasants bowed but eyed the royal party with wariness, knowing that imperial visits often meant taxes or levies for wars against the Moors, wars that had forged legends like the Song of Roland but cost lives in ambushes at mountain passes. And upon arrival at the Aquitanian Palace in Poitiers, a structure blending Roman ruins with Frankish additions, Charlemagne found Louis in prayer. His face pale not from guilt but from fasting, yet the emperor's questions elicited hesitant responses about court intrigues, with Louis admitting to disagreements with his brothers over ecclesiastical reforms but denying any hand in their ills, instead suggesting the work of heretics like the adoptionists condemned at the Council of Frankfurt in 794. Who might seek to undermine the dynasty by targeting its secular branches, leaving the pious to inherit. And as father and son talked deep into the night by a hearth crackling with oak logs, sharing memories of hunts and councils, a messenger galloped in from Aachen bearing grim tidings. Charles the Younger had succumbed, his last breath taken amid convulsions, whispering of a woman's laughter in his dreams, a clue that pointed to one of the court ladies, perhaps Rotrud, Charlemagne's daughter, who had been betrothed but never married, harboring resentments over her sidelined role in a male-dominated succession, or maybe Gisela, another daughter devoted to the church but with access to the heirs chambers through sisterly visits, and this feminine angle opened new avenues of inquiry, for women in the Carolingian court wielded influence through whispers and alliances, weaving webs as intricate as the embroideries they crafted in solar rooms, depicting biblical heroines like Judith who slew Holofernes, a tale of cunning that mirrored possible plots, and returning to Aachen with renewed vigor. Charlemagne ordered discreet surveillance of the women's quarters, where Roland's men posed as servants to eavesdrop on conversations laced with gossip about marriages and inheritances, uncovering hints of jealousy toward the heirs' wives, who bore sons that complicated the lineage, such as Hildegard, wife of Charles, rumored to have enemies among the concubines vying for favor, and as layers peeled back, a breakthrough came when a maid confessed to switching goblets at a feast, directed by a note promising gold. A note traced to a forge in the palace smithy where weapons were crafted. For the Skara, the elite guard, and the smith, a burly man with scars from battles against the Danes, admitted under threat of the hot irons he wielded to forging seals for an unknown patron, described as a hooded noble with a limp, matching the gait of Count Odo, a border lord from the Spanish March who had lost lands in the Roncesvalles debacle and blamed the heirs for failed campaigns, seeking revenge by allying with Basque remnants, or even Moorish agents across the Pyrenees, where emirs plotted reconquests, and this web expanded southward, prompting Charlemagne to summon envoys from the frontier, who arrived weary from the ride through Occitan hills, reporting sightings of suspicious caravans carrying eastern goods, including nightshade and hemlock disguised as medicinal herbs, traded at markets in Barcelona, a city bridging Christian and Muslim worlds, and as evidence mounted, the emperor pieced together a mosaic of motives, personal grudges, religious zeal, foreign meddling, and familial ambition, all converging on his bloodline like rivers to the sea, the North Sea where Viking longships probed coasts, adding another layer of threat as raids increased, perhaps coordinated with internal chaos to divide defenses. And in a bold move, Charlemagne announced a false recovery for Pepin, baiting the conspirators to act hastily, which they did when an attempt was made on Bernard's life in Italy, thwarted by loyal guards who captured an assassin bearing a Byzantine dagger, engraved with Greek script, translating to "For the true emperor," confirming Eastern involvement, yet the mastermind remained elusive, perhaps a high-ranking figure like Archbishop Ibo of Reims, who had clashed with the heirs over tithe distributions, or even Alcuin himself, whose scholarly pursuits might hide darker arts learned in York from Celtic mystics. But Charlemagne dismissed that, trusting his advisor, and instead focused on a grand inquisition, gathering all suspects in the palace basilica, a domed marvel inspired by San Vitale in Ravenna, where under the mosaics of Christ and Majesty, oaths were sworn on relics of the true cross, brought from Jerusalem via Constantinople, and as tensions peaked, a figure stepped forward, a forgotten bastard son from an early liaison, named Drogo, who had been raised in obscurity but now revealed a grudge over denied inheritance, admitting to orchestrating the poisons through hired agents to claim a share of the empire. But his confession rang false, too convenient, suggesting he was a scapegoat for the true culprit, who watched from the shadows as arrests were made, and as the emperor delved deeper, unearthing letters hidden in chapel altars linking Drogo to Louis's court, the pious son emerged as a reluctant suspect again, torn between faith and family, perhaps manipulated by clerics who saw him as a puppet for church dominance. And the mystery twisted further when a vision struck Charlemagne in prayer, recalling a prophecy from a hermit in the Black Forest, foretelling that the empire would fracture unless the poisoner was kin, echoing the biblical fratricides, and resolved to test loyalties. He staged a family reunion, inviting all remaining heirs and relatives to a feast under heavy guard, where every dish was tasted thrice, and amid the clink of cups and forced merriment, a slip occurred, a glance between Lothair and a servant, leading to the servant's flight and capture in the woods, where he revealed under torture a plot masterminded by Bernard, who sought to eliminate uncles and cousins to unite Italy with the core under his rule, backed by Lombard nationalists and Byzantine gold, a revelation that sent shockwaves, prompting Charlemagne to march an army south, crossing the Alps in a grueling trek reminiscent of Hannibal but without elephants, though he had once possessed one, and upon confronting Bernard in Milan, amid the columns of the ancient Forum, tears and denials flowed, but evidence from seized correspondence proved his guilt. Yet in a twist, the letters were forgeries, planted by the real villain, the Chamberlain's successor, a cunning steward who had risen from serfdom through wit, aiming to destabilize the dynasty to install a puppet and rule from behind the throne, his motive pure greed for the empire's wealth, amassed from conquests like the Avar hoard that included golden peacocks and silver thrones. And as the steward was unmasked in a dramatic assembly, confessing all, in hope of mercy, detailing how he sourced the poison from a Jewish merchant in Mainz, who traded with Arabs unhindered by religious barriers, and distributed it through tainted wine at key moments, targeting heirs to spark chaos he could exploit, Charlemagne felt a mix of relief and sorrow, ordering the traitor's execution by hanging in the palace square, where crowds gathered to witness justice. But even as the news tightened, a final whisper escaped the steward's lips about an accomplice. Still at large, a high-born lady who had supplied names and access, pointing back to the court women, specifically Fastrada's daughter from a previous marriage, who harbored hatred for the legitimate heirs eclipsing her own children, and pursuing this lead, Roland raided her chambers, finding remnants of the herb and incriminating diaries chronicling the plot's evolution, from initial whispers to deadly deeds. A chronicle that exposed alliances with external foes, including a Viking chieftain, who promised raids as distractions, and with the lady's arrest, the web seemed dismantled, but Charlemagne, ever vigilant, knew mysteries lingered, for Pepin's recovery began mysteriously after antidotes were administered, sourced from Alcuin's tomes, and the empire stabilized, though scarred, as the emperor revised his will in 814, naming Louis as sole heir to avert further division. A decision that would lead to future strife among Louis's sons, but for now, peace returned to Aachen's halls, where the echoes of conspiracy faded like morning mist over the Rhine. Yet the emperor, in his final months before his death in January 814, often wondered if all threads were cut, or if shadows still plotted in distant corners, from the foggy British Isles to the sun-baked deserts of Arabia, where new empires rose and old ones crumbled, a cycle as eternal as the stars he gazed upon from his tower. Pondering the fragility of power built on blood and faith, and as this second part draws to a close on that reflective note, the tale's suspense builds toward even greater depths in the chapters yet to unfold, as Emperor Charlemagne, now in the twilight of his reign during those fateful months of 813 leading into 814, found himself ensnared in a labyrinth of renewed doubts that the steward's execution and the lady's arrest had not fully eradicated the poison's root from his court. For whispers persisted like autumn leaves rustling in the wind-swept courtyards of Aachen, where servants exchanged furtive glances and nobles averted their eyes during assemblies, hinting at layers of conspiracy yet unpeeled, much like the onion domes of distant Byzantine churches that symbolized the multifaceted intrigues from the east. And as Charlemagne sat in his throne room one stormy afternoon, rain pattering against the stained glass windows depicting scenes from the Book of Revelation with apocalyptic beasts and heavenly hosts, a vision that mirrored his own fears of an empire unraveling into chaos, he received a sealed parchment from a rider who had braved flooded rivers and bandit-infested forests from the distant subkingdom of Bavaria, where his grandson Theodoric held sway over alpine valleys rich in salt mines and timber, resources that fueled the Carolingian economy alongside the grain from Neustrian fields and the horses from Austrasian studs. But the message bore ill tidings of another affliction striking Theodoric, symptoms eerily akin to those that had claimed Charles the Younger and nearly felled Pepin. Feverish nights plagued by nightmares of spectral warriors from past battles, a metallic tang in every sip of ale, and limbs weakening as if drained by invisible leeches, prompting Charlemagne to suspect that the plot extended beyond the arrested culprits, perhaps a wider cabal involving regional lords who chafed under central authority, lords like the Duke of Bavaria, Tassilo, whom Charlemagne had deposed years earlier for rebellion, imprisoning him in a monastery where his descendants might still plot vengeance through proxies, using networks of kin scattered across the empire like seeds from a dandelion blown by winds of discontent. And determined to stem this tide, the emperor summoned his war-hardened paladins, the 12 peers immortalized in later chansons de geste. Though in reality a cadre of loyal counts and knights like Egehard and Anselm who had fallen at Roncesvalles, their places filled by survivors such as Roland's kin, tasking them with a secret mission to infiltrate the Bavarian court disguised as merchants trading in amber from the Baltic shores, where Slavic traders bartered with Frankish outposts amid tensions that could erupt into border skirmishes. And as these agents departed under cover of night, their cloaks blending with the shadows of the palace walls built from Roman spolia repurposed for Carolingian glory, Charlemagne turned to introspection in his private oratory, kneeling before An altar adorned with a reliquary containing a thorn from Christ's crown, a gift from the Patriarch of Jerusalem that symbolized suffering and redemption, praying for guidance amid the moral quagmires of ruling an empire where justice often demanded blood, recalling his own edicts in the Capitulary of Thionville that mandated fair trials but allowed torture for grave crimes. A duality that now weighed on him as he pondered whether the steward's final whisper was a lie to sow discord or a truth. Pointing to deeper betrayal, perhaps from within the ecclesiastical hierarchy, where bishops like Agobard of Lyon advocated for stricter orthodoxy and might view the heir's worldly pursuits, hunting, feasting, and amassing wealth, as sinful obstacles to a godly realm, and this suspicion grew when Alcuin, his trusted scholar, presented an intercepted missive from the Archbishop of Mainz, hinting at clandestine meetings in cathedral crypts where plots were hatched under the guise of liturgical discussions, blending heresy hunts with political machinations that could employ poisons distilled in monastic herbariums, gardens tended by monks versed in the works of Dioscorides, the ancient Greek physician whose De Materia Medica detailed deadly plants like aconite and belladonna, imported from Mediterranean shores via the trade hubs of Venice and Amalfi, where Italian city-states navigated between Frankish suzerainty and Byzantine influence, and acting on this, Charlemagne dispatched Missi Dominici to audit church properties, uncovering irregularities in tight collections that suggested funds diverted to bribe assassins or alchemists, one of whom was captured in a raid on a riverside hut along the Rhine, a reclusive figure with scarred hands from experiments gone awry, confessing under interrogation to brewing elixirs for a hooded patron who paid in silver denarii stamped with the emperor's profile. An ironic twist that fueled Charlemagne's paranoia, leading him to melt down. Suspect coinage in the palace mint and recast it with vigilant inscriptions invoking divine protection, yet even as these measures tightened security, a new incident shattered the fragile calm, an attempt on Louis the Pious himself during a pilgrimage to the shrine of Saint Martin at Tours, where en route through the Loire Valley's vineyards, his entourage was ambushed by masked riders who loosed arrows tipped with a sticky residue that burned the skin, forcing Louis to seek refuge in a nearby abbey, from whence he sent a frantic appeal to his father, describing the attackers' banners as bearing pagan symbols reminiscent of the Irminsul, the sacred pillar Charlemagne had destroyed in his Saxon campaigns to symbolize the triumph of cross-over-tree worship, suggesting a resurgence of heathen resistance led by underground cults that blended old gods with Christian veneer. Cults possibly infiltrated by Viking spies from the north, where Danish kings like Godfred built the Danevirke earthworks to defy Frankish expansion, and in retaliation, Charlemagne mobilized a fleet along the North Sea coasts, shallow draft vessels crewed by Frisians skilled in navigating tidal marshes, to raid Viking strongholds and capture prisoners for questioning, yielding tales of a Frankish trader who had visited Scandinavian halls, offering maps of imperial vulnerabilities in exchange for berserker warriors trained in stealthy killings, warriors who could slip into courts disguised as skalds, reciting epics of Thor's hammer to mask their deadly intent, and weaving these threads, the emperor convened a synod in Aachene's chapel, gathering prelates from across the realm, from the Archbishop of Canterbury to the Bishop of Barcelona, to debate the intersection of faith and treason, enacting canons that excommunicated plotters and mandated loyalty oaths sworn on gospel books illuminated with gold leaf and vibrant inks from eastern dyes. But amid the solemn chants and incense clouds, a monk collapsed foaming at the mouth after sipping communion wine, revealing yet another poisoning attempt that spared the high clergy but claimed an innocent, escalating fears that the conspirators had infiltrated the very heart of religious life, perhaps a radical faction inspired by the iconoclast controversies raging in Byzantium, where Emperor Leo V revived bans on images, viewing Charlemagne's veneration of relics as idolatrous and worthy of divine punishment through human agents, and to counter this, Charlemagne sought alliances with moderate Byzantine factions, sending envoys laden with gifts of Frankish swords and hunting falcons across the Adriatic, negotiating in the opulent halls of the great palace where mosaics depicted imperial triumphs, but responses were evasive, laced with diplomatic pleasantries that hid potential complicity, prompting the emperor to turn inward, auditing his own household with Roland's help, who uncovered a hidden compartment in the ladies' confiscated trunk containing correspondence with the Lombard duke, revealing a subplot to revive the kingdom of Italy independent of Frankish control, fueled by nostalgia for Desiderius's rule and resentment over the Iron Crown's subjugation, a crown Charlemagne had worn but now rested in Mons' treasury, guarded by monks who might be swayed by promises of autonomy. And as investigations branched like the Danube's delta into myriad channels, news from the east brought word of unrest among the Moravians, Slavic peoples on the fringes where missionaries like Cyril and Methodius would later spread the faith, but now sites of pagan holdouts possibly allied with the poisoners, using herbal lore from Carpathian forests to supply toxins via river barges to sympathetic contacts in Vienna, then a frontier outpost, and Charlemagne, recalling his Avar wars where he had seized the ring's treasures after breaching earthen ramparts with siege engines, drew parallels to besieging this invisible foe, ordering fortifications around key palaces and herbal inspections by trusted physicians trained in Salerno's emerging medical school, blending Greek, Arab, and Latin knowledge in treatises that detailed antidotes like theriac, a complex mixture of viper flesh and herbs that he mandated for all royal meals, yet efficacy waned as Theoderic's condition deteriorated, his missives growing feeble, describing hallucinations of ancestral ghosts accusing him of unworthiness, echoes of Charlemagne's own lineage marred by the hunchbacked Pepin's rebellion and imprisonment, a family scar that perhaps invited curses from disgruntled spirits or living kin. And in a desperate bid, the emperor consulted a seeress from the Vosges mountains, a hermit woman reputed for prophetic dreams, who arrived veiled and spoke in riddles about a serpent in the garden, coiling around the tree of succession, interpreting it as a reference to Eden but applied to the palace orchards where rare fruits from Persia were cultivated, fruits that could be laced with death, leading to a purge of gardeners and a replanting with vetted seeds. But her visions also pointed north to the Saxon marches, where Wittekind's descendants might still harbor grudges from the 30-year war that ended with mass baptisms in the Weser River, baptisms enforced at sword point but breeding covert pagans who practiced blood rituals in hidden clearings. Rituals that could include cursing effigies of the emperor's heirs with pins dipped in venom from adders nesting in heathlands, and dispatching Roland once more, this time with a cohort of mounted warriors clad in mail hauberks forged in Metz's armories, to scour the Teutoburg forest for such enclaves. They unearthed a shrine with altars stained red and idols carved from oak, capturing a priest who, under duress, named a Frankish noble as his patron, a count from Westphalia who had lost estates in the conquest and sought restitution through chaos that would force Charlemagne to redistribute lands, and arresting this count in his hilltop castle overlooking the Ruhr Valley. Interrogators extracted details of a supply chain linking herbalists in the Heirs mountains to couriers posing as minstrels wandering between courts, singing ballads of heroic defiance that covertly recruited sympathizers. And this breakthrough unraveled a segment of the plot, but the emperor sensed it was but one tentacle of a kraken-like conspiracy, perhaps masterminded by a coalition of foes, Byzantines providing gold, Vikings muscle, Lombards local knowledge, and church radicals moral justification, all converging to dismantle the Carolingian edifice before Charlemagne's death could solidify it, a death he felt approaching despite his robust health, marked by aches from old wounds sustained in sieges like that of Zaragoza in Spain, where Saracen arrows had grazed him, teaching humility in defeat. And to fortify his legacy, he accelerated the education of surviving heirs, gathering them in Aachen school under Alcuin's tutelage, studying grammar, dialectic, and astronomy with instruments from Baghdad's House of Wisdom, gifts from Harun al-Rashid alongside the elephant that had marveled crowds before its death, symbolizing the transience of power, and amid lessons on Ptolemy's spheres. Louis confided in his father about dreams of unity under pious rule, but Charlemagne detected ambition, veiled as devotion, reminiscent of his own brother's abdication that cleared his path, though voluntary or coerced remained debated in hushed tones, and as winter deepened, snow blanketing the palace roofs like a shroud, a caravan arrived from the east bearing exotic remedies, opium tinctures and mandrake roots from Persian apothecaries, escorted by Armenian merchants fluent in multiple tongues, who shared tales of similar court poisonings in the Sassanid era, advising on detection methods like silver spoons turning black in tainted food, a test Charlemagne implemented forthwith, saving a banquet from disaster when a dish of venison darkened the metal, tracing back to a cook bribed by an agent from the Spanish March, where Mayat influences lingered despite the buffer zone at the Pyrenees, and pursuing this lead, envoys crossed into Al-Andalus under truce flags, negotiating with Emir al-Hakam in Cordoba's Alcazar, exchanging intelligence on mutual threats like Berber rebels, but gleaning hints of Moorish alchemists supplying venoms through smuggling rings along the Mediterranean coasts, rings disrupted by Frankish patrols but resilient like weeds in fertile soil. And back home, the mystery evolved when a forgotten chronicle surfaced from the palace library, a dusty volume from the Merovingian era detailing analogous successional killings with symptoms matching the current plague, attributing them to a secret society of druids surviving Roman purges, society that might persist in Celtic fringes like Brittany, where Armorican tribes paid lip service to Frankish overlords but preserved ancient lore and oral traditions passed by bards at menhir gatherings, and sending agents to Campere's rocky shores, they infiltrated festivals, overhearing plots to weaken the empire for independence, capturing a druid who revealed formulas for slow-acting toxins derived from mistletoe, sacred to their rites. Distributed via pilgrim routes to Compostela, routes Charlemagne had patronized with hostels and bridges to facilitate devotion but now served darker purposes, and integrating this, the emperor realized the conspiracy's scope spanned his entire realm, from Atlantic waves to Danubian plains, necessitating an empire-wide edict proclaiming amnesty for informants, flooding Aachen with testimonies that overwhelmed scribes, recording tales of sightings, ghostly figures in cloaks, unusual birds carrying messages, strange markings on trees guiding couriers, and sifting through this deluge, patterns emerged linking to a central figure, an exiled noble from the Aquitanian court, banished for corruption but harboring grudges, operating from a hidden lair in the Pyrenean foothills, coordinating with Basque guides familiar from Roncesvalles, and mounting an expedition Charlemagne led personally despite his age, riding at the head of a column through mist-shrouded passes where echoes of that fateful ambush lingered, ambushing the lair in a dawn raid, capturing the noble amid caches of vials and maps pinpointing Heirs' locations, his confession unveiling alliances with all suspected parties, a grand design to fragment the empire into manageable fiefdoms for exploitation. But in a final twist, he named an inside man, Alcuin himself, the scholar whose access and knowledge made him ideal, though loyalty had wavered under promises of a learned utopia free from warrior kings. A betrayal that shattered Charlemagne, leading to Alcuin's tearful admission of doubt. But denial of action, exposing instead a forgery to divide trust, the true mastermind revealed as the emperor's own physician, a man from Constantinople schooled in Hippocratic oaths but corrupted by ambition, aiming to install a puppet heir he could control, his arrest in the apothecary amid bubbling cauldrons marking the climax, with antidotes administered saving Theoderic and stabilizing the line, allowing Charlemagne to revise his succession in peace. Though shadows of doubt lingered as he passed in 814, his empire intact but fragile, a legacy of unity amid perpetual intrigue. And as this third part concludes on that resolute yet haunting note, the narrative's enigmas promise to delve into unforeseen realms in the ensuing segments, as Emperor Charlemagne, in the waning days of his life during that pivotal winter of 813 to 814. When frost etched intricate patterns on the palace windows like the delicate filigree of Byzantine jewelry he had admired in diplomatic gifts, found his mind wandering through a maze of unresolved threads that the physician's arrest had only partially untangled, for even as the traitor's chains clanked in the dungeon depths below Aachen's towering structures, built upon thermal springs that once soothed Roman legions and now warmed the imperial baths where Charlemagne sought solace in steaming waters infused with herbs from Provençal fields, he couldn't shake the nagging suspicion that the poisonings were but symptoms of a grander malady afflicting his empire, a festering discord sown by decades of conquests that had expanded borders but stretched loyalties thin, from the windswept plains of Pannonia where Magyar horsemen tested frontiers to the misty Isles of Britain where Anglo-Saxon kings like Offa of Mercia had exchanged embassies but harbored envy for Carolingian splendor. And as he soaked in the baths one evening, steam rising like incense from pagan altars he had toppled in his zeal to Christianize the continent, a courier arrived, drenched from a relentless downpour, bearing a scroll from the distant outpost of Hamburg, where Archbishop Ansgar would later missionize the north but now served as a bulwark against Danish incursions, reporting a eerie sighting of a ghost ship beached on the Elba's sandy shores, its hull carved with runes matching those on the cryptic notes that had plagued the court, and aboard, amid crates of salted herring and amber beads, lay a chest containing vials of a iridescent liquid that shimmered under torchlight, analyzed by local alchemists as a variant of the Orient's infamous flying death, poison, capable of being aerosolized in mist to infect through breath alone, an innovation that hinted at collaboration with distant inventors from the Tang dynasty in China, whose Silk Road caravans carried not just porcelain and tea but forbidden knowledge of gunpowder precursors and toxic vapors. Knowledge that might have filtered westward through Abbasid Baghdad, where Harun al-Rashid's court. Scholars translated Aristotle and experimented with distillation apparatuses that could refine deadly essences from scorpion venom and night-blooming flowers, and this discovery propelled Charlemagne to expand his inquiries beyond continental bounds, dispatching longships crewed by intrepid Frisians, masters of the treacherous North Sea waves that crashed against dikes built to reclaim land from the brine, to probe the Scandinavian fjords where Viking jarls feasted in longhouses adorned with dragon-headed prows, seeking alliances or confessions from chieftains like Sigurd who raided Frankish monasteries for silver chalices and illuminated manuscripts that now might hold encoded clues if pilfered pages had been ransomed back through shadowy intermediaries and trading posts like Hedeby, a bustling emporium where furs from the frozen north met spices from the sultry south. And as these maritime agents set sail under grey skies pregnant with sleet, the emperor turned his gaze inward once more, convening a council of his most erudite minds in the palace library, shelves groaning under the weight of codices copied in the scriptorium's candlelit vigils, works by Boethius on consolation amid adversity, Isidore of Seville's etymologies tracing word origins like family lineages, and Vitruvius on architecture that inspired Aachen octagonal chapel with its dome echoing Ravenna's mausoleums. And there, amid the scent of vellum and ink, Alcuin, redeemed from suspicion through unwavering service, proposed a systematic decryption of all anomalous communications accumulated during the crisis, employing ciphers learned from Irish monks who had preserved classical learning through Viking raids on Lindisfarne, ciphers that revealed recurring motifs of a shadow crown, a metaphor perhaps for a rival claimant lurking in the genealogical underbrush of Charlemagne's sprawling family tree, branched from multiple unions including his marriage to Desiderius's daughter after conquering Lombardy, a political match that bore no heirs but sowed seeds of resentment among Italian kin who viewed the Frankish overlay as a yoke heavier than the Alps snows, and delving into dusty genealogies illuminated with miniature portraits of bearded kings and veiled queens. The council unearthed references to a distant cousin, a descendant of the deposed Merovingian line, long thought extinguished in monastic obscurity but possibly revived in secret, harboring claims to the throne based on ancient blood rights predating the Carolingian ascent under Pepin the Short, who had usurped the child king Childeric III with papal blessing, a usurpation that might now invite karmic retribution through orchestrated demises. And to verify this, Charlemagne ordered exhumations in the Abbey of St. Denis, where Merovingian bones lay interred beneath Gothic arches rising like prayers to heaven, analyzed by physicians for traces of similar poisons in preserved tissues, a macabre task that yielded faint residues of arsenic, a timeless assassin's tool mined from Bohemian ores and traded along amber routes, suggesting a historical pattern of regicidal intrigue that cycled through Frankish history like the seasons turning from verdant springs to barren winters, and as reports filtered back, confirming anomalies in the old king's remains, the emperor's resolve hardened. Like the iron in his sword Joyeuse, forged in legendary fires and said to contain a splinter of the Holy Lance, empowering him to pierce veils of deception, leading to a manhunt for this phantom claimant, rumored to dwell in a fortified hermitage in the Ardennes forest, a dense woodland of ancient oaks and winding streams where legends spoke of druidic holdouts and werewolf packs prowling under full moons, and deploying trackers schooled in the arts of the hunt, scenting hounds bred from Irish wolfhounds and falconers with birds trained to spot hidden trails from azure skies. Roland led the expedition through thorny undergrowth and fog-shrouded valleys, ambushing the hermitage at twilight when campfires flickered like will-o'-the-wisps, capturing the cousin amid relics of bygone royalty, a rusted scepter and faded tapestries depicting Clovis's baptism by Remigius. A pivotal moment that Christianized the Franks but left pagan undercurrents simmering and under interrogation in Aachen. Towers, the claimant confessed to funding peripheral elements of the plot, driven by visions of restoring Merovingian glory, but denied direct hand in the poisons, pointing instead to a network of disaffected vassals from the peripheral marches, such as the Gascon dukes who remembered autonomy before the submission after Poitiers, or the Breton counts who paid tribute but plotted uprisings with Armorican alliances. Alliances that extended to Irish sea kings navigating the Atlantic swells in currachs of hide and willow, carrying messages sealed in wax imprinted with Celtic knots, and this oceanic dimension unveiled a broader conspiracy tapestry, woven with threads from Hibernia's monastic scriptoria where illuminated gospels like the Book of Kells preserved lore alongside subversive tracts, perhaps smuggled to the continent via pilgrim ships docking at Nantes, a port buzzing with merchants from as far as Constantinople, where the Bosporus Straits linked east and west in a nexus of espionage, and Charlemagne, envisioning this global web, fortified coastal defenses with watchtowers along the channel, manned by Saxon converts eager to prove loyalty after their subjugation, scanning horizons for hostile sails while inland. He reformed administrative capitularies to root out corruption, mandating oaths of fealty sworn on saintly relics transported from Rome's catacombs. Relics that included bones of martyrs whose steadfastness inspired his own against this insidious threat. Yet even as reforms took hold, a fresh outbreak struck, grandsons in the Italian subkingdom complaining of tainted dreams and lingering coughs after feasting on game from Apennine hunts, game possibly sabotaged by poachers in league with Calabrian bandits who resented Frankish taxes on olive groves and vineyards yielding wines exported to northern tables, and tracing the supply chain through ledger audits in Pavia's chancery, where scribes tally tolls from alpine passes traversed by meal trains laden with amphorae. Investigators uncovered tampered seals on casks, laced with a fungal toxin from ergot-ridden rye, a blight that induced visions akin to those in ergotism outbreaks during famines, outbreaks that had plagued the empire's breadbaskets in lean years following harsh winters or locust swarms from African winds. And this agricultural angle opened vistas into sabotage of the very sustenance sustaining the realm, prompting Charlemagne to inspect granaries along the Rhine. Vast silos built on Roman foundations storing wheat from Lotharingian fields fertilized by river silts, discovering infestations engineered by moles within the provisioning guilds regulated by his edicts but infiltrated by opportunists from Flemish weaving towns where economic grievances festered amid toll disputes on Scheldt navigation, and purging these elements with public trials in market squares ringed by timber-framed houses, where crowds jeered at the condemned dangling from gallows. The emperor sought holistic remedies, consulting agronomists influenced by Varro's Roman treatises on farming, implementing crop rotations and herbal wards against pests. But the human pestilence proved trickier, as confessions cascaded into naming a shadowy fraternity dubbed the Veiled Serpents, a clandestine order drawing from Gnostic heresies condemned at Nicaea, blending esoteric knowledge with political subversion, meeting in cavernous hideouts beneath ruined Roman aqueducts in Gaul, where echoes amplified whispered oaths to dismantle imperial unity for a federation of autonomous principalities, each ruled by enlightened initiates versed in Platonic ideals filtered through Arabic translations. And to dismantle this order, Charlemagne enlisted inquisitors trained in the arts of dialectic, debating suspects in torchlit chambers to expose logical fallacies in their defenses. Yielding maps of meeting sites from the Pyrenees to the Balkans, where Bulgar Khans bordered the empire and occasionally raided for slaves and horses, perhaps in coordination to distract from internal erosions, and launching synchronized raids across the realm, from torching hideouts in the Black Forest's misty depths to flooding catacombs in Paris with Seine waters to flush out fugitives. The campaign netted key figures: a philosopher from Cordoba schooled in Averroes's precursors, a runes master from Uppsala's pagan temples, and a cartographer from Venice who charted escape routes through lagoon mazes. And their interrogations painted a portrait of a master puppeteer, a figure known only as the Eclipse, symbolizing the darkening of Charlemagne's star, rumored to be a high-placed advisor exiled years prior for embezzlement, but now operating from an island monastery in the Adriatic, accessible only by gondola-like crafts through treacherous currents, and mounting a naval assault with vessels borrowed from Amalfitan allies, whose fleets plied the Tyrrhenian sea trading salt and silks. Roland stormed the isle at moonrise, breaching walls etched with alchemical symbols under a barrage of Greek fire projectiles adapted from Byzantine recipes shared in uneasy truces, capturing the eclipse amid tomes of forbidden lore, Necronomicon-like grimoires blending Cthulhu-esque myths with practical toxicology, though anachronistic in name but evocative in dread. And dragging him back to Aachen in irons forged hot from the palace smithy, the unmasking revealed him as a bastard brother, long thought dead in a border skirmish, consumed by envy for the throne he could never claim, his plot a magnum opus of vengeance spanning years, enlisting every disgruntled faction from heretic clerics to foreign potentates. all lured by promises of carved-up territories in a post-Carolingian world, and with his confession extracted over weeks of psychological duels rather than physical torment. Honoring Charlemagne's evolving sense of justice influenced by Christian mercy, the full scope emerged, poisons tailored to each heir's weaknesses, distributed through a chain of unwitting couriers from camel caravans crossing Saharan dunes to slay riders traversing frozen Baltic ice. A logistics marvel rivaling the empire's own postal relays established along Roman roads revived under Carolingian engineering, and dismantling this apparatus, Charlemagne issued amnesties for minor participants, integrating reformed heretics into monastic orders to channel their intellects towards scriptural exegesis, while executing the court cabal in a spectacle at Eastertide, symbolizing resurrection from the brink of dynastic death, and as heirs recovered under regimens of milk thistle and charcoal purges, the empire exhaled in relief, borders secured with new palisades and alliances renewed through marriages, like Louis's sons betrothed to noble daughters from Saxon and Lombard lines to knit fractures, yet in his final reflections, penned in a private diary bound in elephant hide from Abul Abbas's successor, Charlemagne pondered the eternal vigilance required to sustain power. A lesson etched in blood and ink as he succumbed to pleurisy in January 814, his tomb in Aachen Chapel becoming a pilgrimage site where future kings like Otto would draw inspiration, though the seeds of division sprouted in the Lotharingian wars among his grandsons, a bittersweet epilogue to the mystery that had tested the foundations of his legacy. And as this fourth part winds to its contemplative close, the story's horizons expand into uncharted mysteries awaiting revelation in the parts to come. The parts to come. As Emperor Charlemagne's spirit seemed to linger in the ethereal mists of Aachen Chapel long after his earthly departure in that cold January of 814, when snow blanketed the empire like a white shroud over a battlefield strewn with the fallen from his countless campaigns. From the sun-scorched plains of Spain where Moorish lances had clashed against Frankish shields to the frozen tundras of the north where Viking axes tested the resolve of border guards manning earthen ramparts along the Ida River, and though history records his death as one from natural causes, a feverish pleurisy that racked his aged body after a lifetime of relentless horseback rides through rain-soaked forests and siege lines under blazing suns, the whispers of the court suggested otherwise, fueling legends that the great unifier himself had fallen victim to the very web of poison and intrigue that had ensnared his heirs in the preceding months, a web that, despite the unmasking of the eclipse and the purging of his fraternity, appeared to have tendrils reaching into the afterlife of his legacy, as if the mysteries refused to die with the man who had forged an empire from the ashes of Roman ruins and barbarian hordes. And in the immediate aftermath, as Louis the Pious ascended the throne amid solemn ceremonies in the octagonal chapel where mosaics gleamed with gold tesserae depicting Christ Pantocrator overseeing the coronation, his father's shadow loomed large. Not just in the imperial regalia he donned, the crown, scepter, and orb symbolizing dominion over a realm stretching from the Atlantic to the Elbe, but in the unresolved enigmas that began to resurface like ghosts from forgotten barrows in the Saxon heathlands, where ancient tumuli hid treasures and curses alike, and Louis, ever the devout son clad in simple woolen robes befitting his monastic inclinations despite the pomp of his new role, found himself plagued by dreams of his brothers' pallid faces accusing him from beyond the grave, dreams that mirrored the hallucinatory symptoms of the poisons that had claimed them, prompting him to summon the remaining paladins, including a weathered Roland who had survived the purges and raids, to delve deeper into the archives of the palace library, where dust-moted sunbeams illuminated stacks of parchments chronicling not only victories like the sack of the Avar Ring with its wagon-loads of gold that had funded cathedrals and schools, but also the darker annals of courtly betrayals dating back to the Merovingian shadows, and as they pored over these yellowed pages by candlelight that flickered like uneasy spirits, they uncovered marginal notes in a ciphered script resembling the Agam markings from Irish evangelists who had brought Christianity to the Franks centuries prior, notes hinting at a eternal serpent that coiled through generations. A metaphor perhaps for a hereditary curse or a perpetual conspiracy embedded in the bloodlines like the hereditary offices of mayor of the palace that had elevated the Carolingians to power. And this discovery propelled Louis to order discreet exhumations of his siblings' tombs in the abbeys of Prum and St. Arnulf, where stone sarcophagi carved with crosses and Latin epitaphs guarded remains that, upon examination by physicians versed in the emerging arts of autopsy learned from Arabic texts trickling in via Sicilian translators, revealed lingering traces of exotic toxins not native to European soils, compounds derived from the sap of Amazonian vines or the venom of Indian cobras, suggesting trade routes far beyond the known world, routes plied by adventurous merchants from Genoa and Pisa who ventured into the Levant and beyond, bartering Frankish wool and iron for silks, spices, and secrets from the courts of the Khazars along the Volga or the Tang emperors in Chang'an, where porcelain bowls held potions that could kill or cure with equal subtlety, and pondering this global reach, Louis dispatched emissaries on camelback across the Mediterranean to the Caliphate in Baghdad, renewing alliances forged by his father with Harun al-Rashid, seeking not just diplomatic assurances but alchemical expertise from the House of Wisdom, where scholars like Al-Kindi experimented with distillation and sublimation to isolate deadly essences from mercury and arsenic, essences that might match the residues found, and in return, the caliph's envoys arrived bearing astrolabes for charting stars and manuscripts on toxicology, but also veiled warnings about Byzantine double-dealing, for the Eastern Empire under Michael I Rangabe viewed the Carolingian succession as an opportunity to reclaim lost prestige, perhaps by funding assassins through Armenian middlemen who traversed the Caucasus passes laden with rugs hiding daggers and vials, and as these diplomatic dances unfolded in Aachen's halls adorned with frescoes of biblical kings like David and Solomon, whose wisdom Louis emulated in his pious reforms aimed at purifying the church from simony and lay investiture, a new affliction struck. His own son Lothair, co-ruler of Bavaria, fell ill during a hunt in the Bavarian Alps, where eagles soared over craggy peaks and streams tumbled from glacial melts, complaining of a burning thirst quenched only momentarily by mountain springs, symptoms that echoed the wasting diseases of his uncles, sending ripples of panic through the imperial family gathered for a council in Attigny, a palace nestled in verdant meadows where Charlemagne had once held assemblies to decree laws on everything from bridge maintenance to heresy trials, and there, amid debates on dividing the empire among Louis's sons, Lothair, Pepin, and Louis the German, in the Ordinatio Imperii of 817 that sought to prevent the fratricidal wars that had marred earlier successions, suspicions arose that the poisoning campaign had evolved into a tool for influencing this very partition, perhaps orchestrated by ambitious vassals like the Count of Toulouse who coveted Aquitanian vineyards or the Duke of Spoleto in Italy who chafed under Frankish oversight, dreaming of reviving Lombard autonomy with papal connivance from Rome, where Pope Paschal I navigated the tensions between Eastern and Western rites, and to probe these undercurrents, Louis employed a network of spies disguised as wandering monks, their habits concealing daggers and their psalters hiding coded messages written in invisible ink from lemon juice, infiltrating courts from Cordoba to Constantinople, gathering intelligence on suspect apothecaries in the bazaars of Aleppo or the forums of Thessaloniki, where herbs from the Himalayas mingled with potions from Ethiopian highlands, and reports trickled back of a shadowy alchemist known as the Phoenix, a figure said to rise from the ashes of failed plots, operating from a hidden laboratory in the volcanic caves of Mount Vesuvius, where sulfurous fumes masked his experiments blending Roman plumbum with Persian daru, creating hybrids that evaded common antidotes like the Mithridateum concocted from dozens of ingredients including opium and viper flesh, a universal panacea Charlemagne had sworn by in his later years, and determined to confront this phantom, Roland, now graying but unbowed, led an expedition southward through the Pavali's fertile paddies and over the Apennines' winding trails, where bandits lurked in olive groves once patrolled by Roman legions, arriving at the Bay of Naples under cover of a merchant guise trading Frankish horses for Neapolitan wines to gain entry to local guilds, and from there, scaling the smoldering slopes of Vesuvius amid ash clouds that choked the air like the breath of Hades, they stormed the cave lair illuminated by glowing crucibles, capturing the Phoenix amid retorts bubbling with iridescent liquids that shifted colors like chameleons on Byzantine mosaics, and hauling him northward in a caged wagon rattled over cobblestone roads built by Appius Claudius, the alchemist revealed. Under monastic questioning, conducted with prayer rather than pain, per Louis's merciful edicts, a patronage from a coalition of ousted nobles, including descendants of Tassilo of Bavaria exiled to distant monasteries but nursing grudges like wolves in sheep's clothing. Allied with the Umayyad agents from Al-Andalus who sought revenge for the failed invasions halted at Tours by Charles Martel, grandfather of Charlemagne, a battle whose echoes resounded in ballads sung by troubadours in Occitan halls, ballads that might encode instructions for saboteurs posing as itinerant singers wandering between feasts, and this minstrel connection unveiled a cultural vector for the conspiracy, prompting Louis to scrutinize the bards at his court, whose lutes and harps accompanied tales of Roland's horn at Roncesvalles, but now suspected of lacing lyrics with subliminal cues for assassins hidden among the retainers, and auditing performances in the Great Hall where tapestries depicted the tree of Jesse foretelling messianic lines akin to the Carolingian dynasty. Investigators decoded verses revealing drop points for poison parcels in churchyards under specific gravestones carved with crosses entwined by serpents, symbols of the Nick fall but here signifying the fall of heirs, and raiding these sites from Metz to Milan, they unearthed caches of sealed ampoules labeled in Arabic script, translated by Jewish scholars from the Rhineland communities protected by Charlemagne's charters, scholars who bridged Christian and Muslim worlds with their knowledge of Avicenna's precursors in medicine, identifying the contents as a slow-acting neurotoxin from the bark of African acacias. Imported via Saharan caravans to Moorish ports like Tangier, then shipped northward to sympathetic contacts in Marseille's bustling harbors where Provençal traders mingled with Saracen sailors under uneasy truces, and expanding the net, Louis forged pacts with the Doge of Venice, whose galleys dominated the Adriatic, to intercept suspect vessels flying neutral flags but carrying contraband concealed in amphorae of olive oil, yielding captures of crews who, under amnesty offers, named a mastermind in the papal curia, a cardinal with ties to the old Roman families. Resentful of Frankish popes like Leo III who had crowned Charlemagne, viewing the imperial title as a dilution of Petrine authority, and marching on Rome with an army of Alemannian spearmen clad in leather hauberks, Louis confronted the Pope in the Lateran Palace amid frescoes of Constantinian donations, extracting concessions and the cardinal's extradition, whose confessions in Aachen dungeons detailed a theological motive, purifying the empire of unworthy heirs to install a theocratic regime under ecclesiastical control, blending Augustinian city of God with temporal power, a vision that had seduced clerics from Compostela to Canterbury, and dismantling this faction through synods at Pavia and Rome, Louis enacted reforms stripping bishops of secular lands unless sworn to loyalty. But even as stability beckoned, a twist emerged when Lothaire's recovery faltered. His physicians discovering an implanted relic, a thorn purportedly from Christ's crown but laced with contact poison, hidden in his prayer book by a confessor with Byzantine leanings, suggesting the intrigue's persistence like a hydra regrowing heads, and renewing the hunt, envoys sailed to the Golden Horn, negotiating in Hagia Sophia's domed vastness with Emperor Leo V, whose iconoclastic purges mirrored Louis's reforms but hid espionage networks using monastic cells as safe houses from Mount Athos to the Sinai deserts, where anchorites guarded scrolls of ancient poisons from Cleopatra's era, and bartering for peace with gifts of Frankish reliquaries, they gleaned names of agents embedded in the Carolingian court, leading to purges of the chancery where scribes had altered documents to favor rival claimants, and as layers peeled away like onion skins in a quarter-bound market, the core revealed a familial betrayal. Pepin of Aquitaine, Louis's own son, tempted by whispers of sole rule, had dabbled in the plot before recoiling, his guilt manifesting in self-flagellation at monastic retreats, and, forgiving him in a tearful reconciliation amid the vineyards of Bordeaux, Louis revised the Ordinatio to balance powers, yet shadows lingered as Viking raids intensified along the Seine, perhaps diversionary tactics for smugglers ferrying new toxins from Irish alchemists blending Celtic druidry with Norse runes, prompting fortifications at river mouths with stone keeps manned by Norman converts. And in a climactic revelation, a captured raider confessed to alliance with the Phoenixes' successors, a reborn order operating from Icelandic hot springs where geothermal vents powered forges for alchemical tools. But with fleets dispatched to the volcanic isles, the threat was quelled, allowing the empire to breathe, though divided fates loomed in future civil wars, a testament to the unending vigilance against mysteries that echoed Charlemagne's own struggles. And as this fifth part draws to its intricate resolution, the saga's veils lift toward profound disclosures in the volumes. Ahead. The volumes ahead. As the saga's veils continued to part like morning fog dispersing over the rolling hills of the Frankish countryside, revealing layers upon layers of intrigue that transcended the mortal coil of Emperor Charlemagne and his immediate successors, delving into the ethereal realms where history blurred with legend and the spirits of the past whispered secrets through the windswept corridors of time. And in the years following Louis the Pious' ascension in 814, as he navigated the treacherous waters of governance with a piety that often bordered on asceticism, cloistering himself in prayer vigils at the Abbey of St. Medard where relics of martyrs glowed faintly in candlelit shrines, the mysteries surrounding the heir's afflictions refused to fade into oblivion, instead morphing into a spectral enigma that haunted the imperial lineage like a persistent shadow cast by the towering spires of Aachene's palace chapel, a structure that stood as a testament to Carolingian ambition with its marble columns pilfered from Italian ruins and its dome echoing the architectural grandeur of Justinian's Hagia Sophia, yet now serving as a nexus for supernatural suspicions as courtiers reported apparitions in the moonlit galleries, ghostly figures resembling the deceased heirs, Charles the Younger and Pepin of Italy, their translucent forms gesturing accusingly toward hidden alcoves where forgotten documents moldered, documents that Louis's scholars, successors to Alcuin's erudite circle, began to unearth from sealed chests in the scriptorium's vaults, chests bound with iron hasps forged in the same smithies that had crafted weapons for the Saxon wars, and upon cracking these seals with tools of brass and bone, they discovered chronicles penned in a trembling hand, recounting visions experienced by Charlemagne himself in his final days. Visions of an ethereal council convened in a misty otherworld where ancient kings from Clovis to Dagobert debated the fate of the Frankish bloodline, warning of a primordial curse laid upon the dynasty by druidic priests during the Roman conquests of Gaul, when Caesar's legions had raised sacred groves in the forests of Carnuntum and Elysia, groves where mistletoe-laden oaks had been felled to extinguish Celtic rites that invoked nature spirits to protect tribal lineages, spirits now allegedly awakened by the empire's expansion, seeking vengeance through subtle maladies that mimic natural deaths but carried the chill of the supernatural. And Louis, ever the theologian schooled in Augustine's City of God and Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy, interpreted these accounts not as mere superstition but as divine admonitions, prompting him to convene an ecclesiastical synod in the year 816 at the Palace of Attigny, where bishops from the sees of Reims, Tours, and Sens gathered under vaulted ceilings painted with frescoes of apostolic miracles, debating the intersection of pagan remnants and Christian orthodoxy, enacting canons that mandated the destruction of lingering heathen altars scattered across the countryside from the Breton marches to the Bavarian highlands, altars where villagers still left offerings of milk and bread under the guise of folk customs, but which might serve as focal points for cursing rituals aimed at the imperial house. And to enforce this, Louis dispatched teams of missi dominici, royal inspectors clad in cloaks of undyed wool symbolizing humility, to roam the provinces with mandates to uproot standing stones inscribed with Ogham script and burn effigies found in hidden shrines, yet even as bonfires crackled in village squares, illuminating faces twisted in a mix of fear and defiance, reports flooded back of retaliatory omens, crops withering overnight in patterns resembling runes, wells turning brackish with a bitter aftertaste reminiscent of the poisons that had felled the heirs, and livestock birthing malformed young that lowed with voices echoing human cries, phenomena that local priests attributed to demonic influences stirred by the purges, influences perhaps channeled through a clandestine order of neo-druids who had survived in the remote valleys of the Vosges and Pyrenees, blending their lore with heretical Christian sects like the Paulicians fleeing Byzantine persecutions across the Mediterranean, sects that viewed the material world as evil and sought to undermine temporal powers through occult means. And delving deeper, Louis's investigators, led by a steadfast abbot from Fulda named Rabanus Maurus, a scholar whose Alcuin-inspired encyclopedia encompassed everything from astronomy to zoology, infiltrated these mountainous enclaves disguised as hermits seeking solitude, their staffs concealing scrolls of incantations copied from forbidden tomes smuggled from Irish monasteries like Bangor, where Celtic Christianity preserved echoes of pre-Roman mysticism, and in fog-shrouded caves lit by phosphorescent fungi clinging to damp walls, they overheard rituals invoking the names of Tutates and Epona, ancient deities woven into invocations against the usurper line of Pippinids, curses amplified by herbal brews distilled from wolfsbane and hemlock gathered under full moons, brews that could be dispatched via wandering peddlers to contaminate palace supplies, and capturing a high priestess in a dawn raid amid thunderclaps rolling over jagged peaks, her robes embroidered with silver threads depicting intertwined serpents symbolizing eternal renewal and venomous strike, They extracted confessions under the gentle persuasion of scriptural debates rather than torture. Per Louis's edicts emphasizing mercy over vengeance, revelations that pointed to a alliance with disgruntled Lombard nobles in the sub-kingdom of Italy, where Bernard, Charlemagne's grandson, had briefly rebelled in 817 before his blinding and death, an event that left scars on the family's conscience and fertile ground for vendettas nurtured in the shadowy villas of Verona and Ravenna, where mosaics of Theodoric the Goth reminded locals of pre-Frankish glories. And these nobles, descendants of Desiderius's court, allegedly funded the Druids' operations with gold from Alpine mines, gold that had once filled Charlemagne's coffers after the Lombard conquests but now circulated in underground economies evading imperial taxes collected along the Per River's toll stations. And as this Italian connection solidified, Louis mobilized a diplomatic offensive, sending envoys southward on mule trains laden with gifts of Frankish reliquaries containing heirs from Saint Denis, patron of the realm, to negotiate with Pope Pascali in the Eternal City's basilicas, where incense swirled around columns salvaged from pagan temples, seeking papal bulls excommunicating the conspirators and authorizing inquisitorial visits to suspect monasteries in Benevento, a duchy teetering between Frankish loyalty and Byzantine intrigue, and in return, the Pope dispatched legates bearing indulgences and warnings of similar plots brewing in the British Isles, where Anglo-Saxon kings like Egbert of Wessex consolidated power amid Viking incursions that sacked Lindisfarne's treasures, incursions perhaps coordinated with the continental curses to divide Christian defenses. And inspired by this, Louis extended his reach across the Channel, chartering ships from Frisian ports like Dorstad, where merchants traded in slaves and furs under the watchful eyes of customs officials enforcing the emperor's monopolies on certain goods, to land agents in Kent's chalky cliffs, where they liaised with Archbishop Wilfrid of Canterbury, exchanging intelligence on Celtic holdouts. In Wales and Cornwall, regions where bards recited epics of Arthurian resistance against Saxon invaders, epics that might encode formulas for ethereal poisons derived from Avalon-like mists and sacred wells. And back on the continent, as autumn leaves turned crimson like blood spilled in the civil strife that would later erupt among Louis's sons, a breakthrough occurred when Rabanus's team deciphered a captured grimoire, its pages of vellum inscribed with inks mixed from gallnuts and iron salts, revealing a calendar of celestial alignments, conjunctions of Mars and Saturn, that amplified the curse's potency, alignments calculated with astrolabes borrowed from Arab astronomers via Spanish frontiers, where the march of Barcelona bridged Christian and Muslim worlds, allowing knowledge of Ptolemy's Almagest to flow northward alongside tales of jinn and ifrits that could possess vessels to deliver unseen maladies, and aligning his countermeasures with these stars, Louis ordered vigils on key dates, gathering the court in Aachen chapel for all-night prayers led by choirs chanting Gregorian modes introduced by his father's reforms, modes that harmonized voices to ward off dissonant spirits. Yet during one such vigil under a comet-streaked sky portending change, a participant, a young scribe from the chancery, collapsed convulsing, his tongue foaming with a substance analyzed as ectoplasmic residue, a phenomenon that blurred the line between physical poison and metaphysical assault, prompting consultations with exorcists trained in the rites of Saint Benedict, who sprinkled holy water from Jordanian ampoules and recited formulas to banish entities perhaps summoned by the Druids' rituals echoing the possessions described in Bede's Ecclesiastical History of the English People, a text copied in the palace school for edification, and as exorcisms echoed through the halls, unearthing possessed individuals among the servants, who babbled in unknown tongues. Resembling ancient Gaulish preserved in glosses on Virgil's manuscripts, the scope widened to include Viking shamans from the north, whose cedar magic woven by seeresses in trance states could project curses across seas, carried on raven wings or embedded in runic amulets traded at markets in Birka, a Swedish hub where amber from the Baltic met spices from the Volga route, and to counter this Nordic threat, Louis negotiated truces with Danish kings like Harald Klak, baptizing them at Ingelheim's palace amid fountains fed by Rhine tributaries, extracting promises to suppress pagan practices in exchange for territorial concessions along the Eider. But betrayals surfaced when a baptized chieftain was caught smuggling cursed idols disguised as Christian crosses, idols hollowed to hold toxic powders from Lappish reindeer moss, powders that induced visions of Valhalla's halls where fallen warriors judged the living. And purging these infiltrators with trials by ordeal, walking hot plows or grasping red-hot irons, ordeals sanctioned by Frankish law despite papal frowns, Louis uncovered a trans-European network linking druids, shamans, and heretics in a bid to fracture the empire into pre-Christian tribal fiefdoms, a vision of decentralization that appealed to peripheral lords from the Slavic frontiers to the Iberian marches, lords who chafed under the centralized tithes and levies imposed by the capitularies of Quierzy and Nijmegen, and in a bold stroke, the emperor convened a grand assembly in 818 at the palace of Nijmegen on the Vaal River, where dikes held back floods like the laws held back anarchy, gathering delegates from all corners, Bavarian dukes with fur-trimmed cloaks, Aquitanian viscounts bearing olive branches, Italian margraves with vine-wreathed staffs, to forge a united front against the occult tide, enacting edicts that standardized exorcism protocols across the realm and established academies for training demonologists blending theology with natural philosophy, academies housed in monasteries like Corbie, where scribes illuminated manuscripts with depictions of archangels battling dragons, symbols of the struggle against the serpent's legacy. And as reforms took root, a pivotal artifact surfaced, a crystal orb reputedly from Charlemagne's treasury, said to have been gifted by Harun al-Rashid alongside the elephant Abul Abbas, an orb that, when gazed upon under lunar light, revealed glimpses of alternate fates where the heirs survived uncursed, guiding Louis to preempt future strikes by fortifying psychic barriers through mass pilgrimages to Rome, where throngs knelt at St. Peter's tomb to invoke apostolic protection, pilgrimages that traversed roads repaired by imperial engineers, roads lined with milestones marking miles from the Milvian Bridge where Constantine had seen his vision, and during one such pilgrimage, a miracle occurred. Or so it was claimed, when Lothair, still recovering, touched a relic of the true cross and expelled a shadowy vapor from his lungs, vapor that coalesced into a fleeting image of the eclipse's face, suggesting the mastermind's spirit lingered, unbound by death, perhaps through necromantic pacts sealed in blood on parchments hidden in catacombs beneath Paris, catacombs expanded from Roman quarries to house the dead but now harboring living occultists, and raiding these underworld labyrinths with torch-bearing guards navigating twists lit by bioluminescent fungi. They unearthed grimoires bound in human skin, detailing spells to bind souls to earthly vendettas, spells countered by masses sung in polyphonic innovations emerging in the schools of St. Gall, where notation on staves captured melodies to soothe savage beasts and banish wraiths, and as the net tightened, capturing spectral mediums who channeled messages from the beyond, the true heart of the curse revealed itself. An ancestral pact made by Pepin the Short with shadowy figures during his usurpation. A pact invoking forbidden powers for legitimacy but exacting a toll on descendants. A revelation pieced from fragmented confessions and visionary trances induced by fasting hermits in the Black Forest cloisters, leading Louis to perform a ritual of atonement at the site of Pepin's coronation in Soissons, where he publicly confessed dynastic sins amid weeping crowds, sprinkling ashes from burned grimoires over the assembly to symbolize purification. And with this catharsis, the afflictions waned, heirs strengthened, and the empire, though destined for division in the Treaty of Verdun in 843 among Lothair, Louis the German, and Charles the Bald, endured as a beacon of Christendom against the encroaching Knights of Mystery, yet echoes persisted in folklore and chronicles, a reminder that some veils remain eternally drawn. And as this sixth part concludes on that transcendent note, the epic's depths beckon with even more labyrinthine revelations in the chapters yet to unfurl. The chapters yet to unfurl. As the epic's depths beckoned with even more labyrinthine revelations that twisted through the annals of time like the intricate roots of an ancient yew tree burrowing deep into the earth of forgotten realms, where the boundaries between the corporeal world and the spectral veil grew ever thinner under the watchful gaze of stars that had witnessed the rise and fall of empires from the pharaohs of Egypt with their pyramid tombs guarding secrets of the afterlife to the Caesars of Rome whose aqueducts carry not just water but whispers of conspiracy across vast provinces, and in the turbulent years of Louis the Pious' reign, stretching from 814 into the 820s when the empire teetered on the brink of fragmentation amid familial rivalries and external pressures from the relentless Viking longships carving bloody paths up the rivers of Francia like the Seine and Loire, laden with dragon-proud vessels crewed by berserkers clad in bear skins and wielding axes forged in the volcanic fires of distant Norse forges. The mysteries enveloping Charlemagne's heirs evolved into a cosmic tapestry woven with threads of destiny, prophecy, an interdimensional intrigue that defied the rational frameworks of the Carolingian Renaissance. A Renaissance that had illuminated the Dark Ages with schools in every monastery from Bobbio in Italy, where Irish monks had established libraries stocked with classical texts salvaged from the fall of Rome, to the island abbey of Reichenau on Lake Constance, where scholars debated the quadrivium of arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy under abbots who charted celestial bodies with brass instruments calibrated to the precision of Ptolemaic models adapted through Arabic lenses. And Louis, his brow furrowed in perpetual contemplation beneath a crown that felt heavier than the stone arches of his palaces, found himself drawn into visions during solitary retreats in the forests of Compiègne, where ancient oaks whispered legends of Merovingian kings who had communed with woodland spirits before their downfall. Visions that portrayed the poisonings not as mere human machinations but as manifestations of a primordial imbalance in the cosmos, triggered by Charlemagne's ambitious unification that had disrupted the natural order of tribal divisions ordained by the fates spun by Norns in Norse mythology or Parsi in Roman lore, entities that now sought restitution through ethereal agents capable of traversing realms, agents perhaps akin to the Valkyries who chose the slain on battlefields like those at Fontenay where future civil wars among Louis's sons would spill brotherly blood. And to unravel this metaphysical knot, Louis summoned a conclave of mystics and theologians to the palace at Ingelheim, a riverside fortress with gardens blooming with roses imported from Damascus via Venetian traders who navigated the Adriatic stormy waves, bringing not just flora but tales of jinn from Arabian Nights that could possess vessels to enact curses from afar. And at this conclave, held in a hall adorned with tapestries depicting the labors of Hercules as allegories for imperial struggles against chaos, participants from diverse corners converged. Byzantine hesychasts practicing silent prayer to achieve divine union, Celtic anchorites from the rocky coasts of Brittany who fasted on seaweed and spring water to induce prophetic trances, and even envoys from the distant court of the Bulgarian Khan Krum, who had clashed with Frankish forces along the Danube but now offered shamans versed in steppe rituals involving horse sacrifices to appease sky gods like Tungri, whose thunderbolts mirrored the storms raging over the Alps during the gathering. Storms that flooded valleys and unearthed ancient artifacts like bronze talismans from Hallstatt cultures predating the Celts, talismans inscribed with symbols that resonated with the runes on the cryptic notes plaguing the court. And as debates echoed through the night, illuminated by beeswax candles scented with frankincense from Somali caravans that traversed Red Sea ports, a consensus emerged that the heir's affliction stemmed from a rift in the veil between worlds. A rift widened by Charlemagne's destruction of sacred sites like the Irminsul Pillar in Saxony, a cosmic axis mundi that had anchored spiritual energies, and its felling had unleashed unbound entities, wraiths of slain pagans, echoes of Roman Lara's household spirits displaced by Christian altars, and perhaps even fallen angels from apocryphal texts like the Book of Enoch, preserved in Ethiopian Gezi manuscripts that had trickled into Europe via Alexandrian traders. And these entities, formless yet potent, infiltrated the dreams and bodies of the heirs, manifesting as poisons that defied alchemical analysis, poisons that shifted forms like mercury in a vial, sometimes appearing as crystalline powders derived from the salts of Dead Sea shores, other times as vaporous essences exhaled by nocturnal blooms in palace greenhouses cultivated with seeds from Persian gardens. And to seal this rift, the conclave prescribed a grand ritual of reconciliation, to be performed at the solstice when the sun's path aligned with ancient megaliths like those at Karnak in Brittany, structures erected by prehistoric peoples to harness celestial powers. And Louis, accompanied by his sons Lothair, Pepin, and Louis the German, each bearing scepters symbolizing their sub-kingdoms, Aquitaine with its vine-entwined rod, Bavaria with its mountain-carved staff, and the Frankish core with its lily-adorned baton, journeyed westward through verdant landscapes dotted with Romanesque churches rising from Merovingian foundations. Churches where frescoes of the Last Judgment warned of apocalyptic reckonings. And upon arriving at the windswept plains of Karnak, where rows of standing stones stretched like silent sentinels toward the Atlantic horizon, crashing waves echoing the turmoil in their souls, the ritual commenced under a twilight sky painted in hues of crimson and indigo, with Druid descendants, reformed and baptized but retaining ancestral knowledge, chanting invocations blended with Latin psalms, circling a bonfire fueled by branches from the sacred oaks of Dodona, imported via Greek merchants from the Peloponnese who traded olive oil for Frankish timber, and as flames leaped high, consuming effigies crafted from wax and herbs representing the disrupted spirits, Louis offered a libation of wine from his own vineyards, mixed with holy water blessed by the Pope in Rome's font of St. John Lateran, a gesture symbolizing the fusion of pagan and Christian essences to mend the tear. Yet midway through the ceremony, a gale arose from the sea, carrying the scent of salt and distant storms brewing over the high Hernan Isles where Celtic myths spoke of Tir na Nog, the land of eternal youth guarded by fairy folk who could curse mortals with wasting diseases, and in the whirlwind, apparitions materialized. Translucent warriors from the Teutoburg forest where Varus's legions had perished to Germanic tribes led by Arminius. Their armor rusted but eyes burning with unresolved rage against Roman heirs like the Franks who claimed that legacy, and these shades, speaking in tongues deciphered by the shamans as pleas for restitution, demanded the restoration of sacred groves felled in the name of progress, groves where once offerings had maintained balance, and Louis, kneeling on the damp earth amid the menhirs that hummed with latent energy as if attuned to ley lines crisscrossing Europe from Stonehenge to Delphi, vowed reforms, decreeing protected forests in the Ardennes and Black Forest where no axe would fall without ritual blessing, and commissioning monasteries to incorporate pagan motifs into their architecture, like intertwined serpents on capitals symbolizing renewal rather than sin, a syncretism that echoed the early church's adaptation of solstice festivals into Christmas. And as the apparitions dissipated with the dying embers, a calm descended, but the mystery deepened when Lothair, touching a menhir inscribed with spirals, experienced a vision of parallel realms where Charlemagne's empire had splintered differently, realms accessed through portals at such sites, portals perhaps exploited by interdimensional travelers, beings from folklore like the Sidhe of Irish tales or the Alfra of Norse sagas, who manipulated events to alter timelines, ensuring the heir's weaknesses amplified divisions, and returning to Aachen with this knowledge, Louis established an order of guardians. Monks trained in esoteric arts blending Gregory the Great's dialogues on miracles with Hermes Trismegistus's Hermetic corpus smuggled from Egyptian libraries via Constantinopolitan scholars fleeing iconoclastic purges, an order tasked with monitoring ley line convergences at sites like the Externstein rocks in Westphalia, natural formations carved with reliefs of the crucifixion overlying pagan sun wheels, and these guardians, cloaked in grey habits embroidered with protective sigils drawn from Solomonic keys, patrolled the empire's mystical frontiers, reporting anomalies like glowing orbs hovering over battlefields from Roncesvalles, orbs that emitted hums resonating with the frequencies of Gregorian chants, and one such report from the Pyrenean passes detailed an encounter with a luminous entity claiming to be a guardian angel displaced by the rift, offering clues to a master entity, a cosmic adversary akin to the demiurge in Gnostic texts, a false creator jealous of Charlemagne's unifying vision that mirrored divine order. And this adversary, manifesting through proxies like possessed animals in the imperial menagerie, lions from African savannas gifted by Berber emirs, or falcons from Arabian deserts trained for hunts, sought to perpetuate chaos by infusing toxins into the bloodline via subtle influences, toxins that evolved from physical to psychic, inducing doubts and rivalries among the brothers. Rivalries that foreshadowed the strife at the Battle of Fontenay in 841 where Lothair clashed with his siblings over inheritance, a battle whose carnage stained the fields of Burgundy with blood that seemed to cry out like Abel's, and to combat this, Louis initiated an empire-wide meditation campaign, teaching nobles and peasants alike techniques of contemplative prayer drawn from Eastern Orthodox hesychasm, repeating the Jesus prayer in rhythmic breaths to fortify the soul against intrusion, while commissioning artists to paint icons of saintly protectors like Saint Michael the Archangel, spear in hand, slaying dragons on panels of poplar wood gilded with gold leaf from Hungarian mines, icons distributed to every chapel from the fjords of Norway, where Frankish influence extended through missionary bishops like Ansgar who braved pagan kings in Hamburg, to the sun-baked walls of Barcelona, where Mozarabic Christians blended Latin rites with Visigothic traditions under the shadow of Moorish threats. And as these spiritual defenses strengthened, a pivotal artifact was rediscovered in the treasury of St. Denis Abbey near Paris, a crystal skull reputedly from Atlantean origins but more likely carved by pre-Columbian artisans whose works had mysteriously arrived via transatlantic drifts or Viking voyages to Vinland, though anachronistic in historical record but fitting the saga's mythical scope, a skull that, when aligned with solar rays through stained glass windows depicting the Tree of Life. Projected holographic visions of alternate histories where the heirs thrived uncursed, guiding Louis to amend the Ordinatio Imperii in 829 at Worms, adjusting territorial allotments to appease the cosmic balance, allotments that granted Lothair the Middle Kingdom with its Rhine spine, Pepin the southwestern realms rich in wine and salt, and Louis the German the eastern marches bordering Slavic tribes like the Obotrites who paid tribute in honey and wax but harbored shamans capable of dream-walking into foreign minds. And yet, amid these adjustments, a new manifestation arose, Pepin of Aquitaine awakening from a fever with memories not his own, recollections of lives in distant eras, from a Roman centurion at the Milvian Bridge witnessing Constantine's vision to a Visigothic king at the sack of Rome in 410, suggesting reincarnation cycles disrupted by the curse, cycles that the cosmic adversary exploited to insert discordant souls into the bloodline. Souls carrying grudges from past defeats, and consulting with reincarnated seers, individuals claiming prior existences as oracles from Delphi or sibyls from Cumae, whose prophecies had shaped empires. Louis learned of a ritual to realign these souls, involving a journey to the oracle seat at Delphi itself, now under Byzantine control but accessible through diplomatic channels forged with Emperor Theophilos, who shared interests in icon veneration despite his iconoclastic leanings, and dispatching a fleet from Marseille's harbors. Vessels with sails billowing like angels' wings, crewed by Provençal sailors versed in navigating Tyrrhenian currents, the expedition reached the Parnassian slopes where ruins of Apollo's temple stood amid olive groves sacred since Homeric times, and there, amid crumbling columns echoing with the ghosts of Pythian priestesses inhaling laurel fumes to prophesy, they performed a syncretic rite blending Delphic invocations with Christian Eucharists, offering bread and wine on altars once dedicated to the sun god. And in the trance induced by the site's energies, visions revealed the adversary's true form, an amalgam of suppressed deities from Odin to Cernunnos, fused into a chaotic force seeking to reclaim worship through imperial downfall, a force countered by invoking the Trinity in tripartite chants that resonated with the site's acoustic mysteries, and as the rite culminated with an earthquake shaking the earth like the one that had buried the oracle in antiquity, the visions promised respite, but warned of lingering echoes in future generations, echoes that would manifest in the Viking Age's fury or the Crusades' zeal. And returning triumphant yet wary, Louis fortified the empire with metaphysical bastions, networks of prayer chains linking monasteries from Monte Cassino to Iona, where monks synchronized vespers to create a harmonic shield against incursions. And as afflictions receded like ebbing tides along the North Sea coasts patrolled by Frankish trekkers adapted from Viking designs, the heirs flourished briefly, forging alliances through marriages to daughters of Saxon dukes and Lombard counts, alliances sealed with feasts where bards sang of reconciled spirits, yet the saga whispered of deeper veils, veils parting to realms where time looped like the Ouroboros swallowing its tail, hinting at infinite regressions of mystery that Charlemagne's ghost observed from ethereal thrones, an observer in the grand cosmic drama. And as this seventh part draws to its expansive close on that infinite horizon, the narrative's abysses invite immersion into yet vaster enigmas in the installments to follow. The installments to follow, as the narrative's abysses invited immersion into yet vaster enigmas that sprawled across the infinite canvas of existence, where the threads of fate intertwined with the quantum filaments of possibility, drawing the saga of Charlemagne's heirs into realms beyond the mortal ken. Realms where time folded upon itself like the pleated robes of Byzantine courtiers in the opulent halls of the sacred palace, and in the escalating turmoil of Louis the Pious' later reign, from the 820s onward when the empire groaned under the weight of internal dissent and external invasions that crashed upon its shores like relentless waves from the North Sea, waves propelled by Viking drakars with sails billowing in gales that carried the salty tang of distant fjords etched with runes of ancient sagas recounting the deeds of Odin and Thor, deities whose one-eyed wisdom and thunderous might seem to mock the Christian cross. Raised high on Frankish banners fluttering over fortified riverbanks lined with sharpened stakes and watchtowers manned by weary sentinels scanning horizons for the telltale silhouettes of longships laden with ironclad raiders seeking plunder in abbeys rich with silver chalices and jeweled reliquaries donated by Charlemagne's conquests. Conquests that had amassed wealth from the Avar hordes of golden stirrups and bejeweled saddles to the tribute of Slavic chieftains in amber necklaces and fur pelts from the endless steppes where horsemen roamed under skies vast as eternity, And Louis, his once youthful face now lined with the cares of a realm fracturing like ice on the Rhine during spring thaws that flooded meadows and drowned villages in muddy torrents, found himself ensnared in revelations that transcended the earlier discoveries of curses and rifts. Revelations whispered in the dead of night by oracles who appeared in his chambers unbidden, their forms shimmering like heat haze. Over desert sands traversed by Saracen caravans bearing myrrh and frankincense from Yemenite ports to the markets of Damascus, oracles claiming descent from the Sibyls of antiquity whose prophecies had guided Aeneas through underworld journeys in Virgil's epic studied in the palace schools where young nobles parsed Latin hexameters under the tutelage of masters like Einhard. Charlemagne's biographer, whose Vita Caroli Magni painted the emperor as a new Augustus but omitted the shadowy undercurrents now surging forth, and these oracles spoke of multiversal convergences where alternate versions of the empire coexisted in parallel dimensions accessed through nexus points at sacred sites like the Mont Saint-Michel off the Norman coast, an island abbey rising from tidal flats like a mirage, its spires piercing clouds that gathered storms brewing over the English Channel. Storms that mirrored the internal tempests as Louis's sons, Lothair with his imperial ambitions. Cloaked in Lombard silks, Pepin ruling Aquitaine from Bordeaux's vine-draped halls where Roman aqueducts still channeled water to thermal baths, and Louis the German fortifying the eastern marches from Regensburg's stone bridges spanning the Danube's swift currents, began to chafe against the Ordinatio's divisions. Divisions meant to preserve unity but instead igniting sparks of rebellion that threatened to ignite like Greek fire hurled from Byzantine dromons in naval battles against Arab fleets. In the Aegean, and to probe these multiversal layers, Louis assembled a cadre of visionaries in the year 825 at the Council of Paris, held in the Basilica of Saint Denis where the tombs of Frankish kings slumbered beneath Gothic vaults aspiring toward heaven, vaults supported by columns of Parian marble imported from Greek quarries via Venetian galleasses rowed by chained captives from Slavic raids. And this cadre included alchemists from the schools of Toledo, where Mozarabic Christians translated Aristotle's metaphysics alongside Al-Khwarizmi's algebra under the tolerant gaze of Umayyad emirs in Cordoba's Alcazar with its horseshoe arches framing gardens of orange blossoms perfuming the air with citrus scents that evoked paradisiacal realms. Realms perhaps glimpsed in the alchemist's retorts where Mercury transmuted base metals into gold symbolic of spiritual ascension, and these savants, their beards dusted with sulfur from experiments in fume filled laboratories lit by oil lamps from Persian wickholders, proposed harnessing the philosopher's stone not for earthly wealth but to bridge dimensional veils, crafting elixirs from rare ingredients like mandrake roots harvested at midnight crossroads in the Harz mountains where witches' sabbaths were rumored to convene under Walpurgis moons. Mixed with dew collected from Stonehenge's sarcens transported in thought experiments if not in physicality, and as the council deliberated amid the scent of incense wafting from censers swung by acolytes in white albs embroidered with golden threads depicting the zodiac's constellations, Aries the ram charging like Frankish cavalry at the Battle of Tours, Taurus the bull steadfast as the empire's borders against Magyar incursions from the Hungarian plains, a demonstration unfolded in the abbey's crypt, where torchlight danced on walls etched with Merovingian graffiti from centuries past, and quaffing the elixir under supervised chants, blending Latin invocations with Aramaic phrases from the Dead Sea Scrolls smuggled by Jewish merchants from the Khazar Khaganate, whose steppe empire converted to Judaism bridged east and west in a mosaic of faiths. Louis experienced a translocation of consciousness, his mind soaring through etheric corridors lined with mirrors reflecting infinite iterations of his life. One where Charlemagne's heirs survived unpoisoned to forge an eternal realm spanning from Iberia to Byzantium, another where the empire crumbled prematurely under Saxon revolts led by resurrected Witikind wielding a sword forged from meteor iron fallen in the Teutoburg forest, forests dense with mist and myth where Roman ghosts wandered lost, their legions eagles still buried in peat bogs awaiting discovery by future archaeologists, and in these visions, the true architect of the mysteries emerged not as a singular entity but as a collective consciousness, a hive mind composed of dissonant souls from collapsed timelines, souls displaced by Charlemagne's conquests that had erased indigenous cosmologies from the map, cosmologies where gods dwelled in every spring and hill, from the Rhine's nixies luring travelers to watery graves to the Danube's vodniks guarding underwater treasures and Slavic folklore that blended with Christian hagiography in borderland chapels dedicated to saints like Saint Florian, patron against floods that symbolized the overwhelming tides of fate, and this hive, pulsating like a nebula in the night sky observed through Arab astrolabes with engraved scales measuring azimuths and altitudes, sought to recalibrate reality by infiltrating the heirs' essences, altering their decisions through subconscious impulses that manifested as inexplicable illnesses, fevers that burned with the heat of alternate suns, chills that echoed the voids between dimensions, and hallucinations vivid as the illuminated manuscripts from the scriptorium of St. Gall, where monks with quills dipped in inks ground from lapis lazuli imported from Afghan mines via Silk Road caravans guarded by Bactrian camels trudging through Gobi sands, depicted scenes of apocalyptic beasts from Revelation that now seemed prophetic of the multidimensional threat, and armed with this insight, Lewis decreed the formation of a secret society, the Order of the Veil Wardens, headquartered in a secluded monastery atop the Mont Ventoux in Provence, where winds howled like banshees from Irish legends carried by Celtic migrants, and this order, recruited from polymaths across the realm, from Frisian navigators charting North Sea routes with lodestones aligned to magnetic poles discovered in Chinese compasses, rumor spread through trader tales, to Lombard engineers building siege engines like trebuchets that hurled stones with the force of divine wrath at rebellious castles in the Apennines. Their mission to map the nexus points using geometric principles from Euclid's Elements translated in Baghdad's Beit al-Hikmah and disseminated westward, points like the Externstein formations where natural rock pillars aligned with solstice sunrises, or the sacred well at Chartres where pre-Christian virgins had divined futures and rippling waters now consecrated to the Virgin Mary in the emerging cathedral's foundations, and equipping the wardens with amulets forged from orichalcum alloys blending copper and zinc in ratios whispered by Atlantean myths preserved in Plato's dialogues copied in monastic libraries, amulets inscribed with sigils combining Kabbalistic trees of life from Sephardic scholars in Narbonne with Norse Yggdrasil branches spanning 9 worlds. They patrolled these sites on horseback clad in mail woven with silver threads to conduct etheric energies, conducting rituals at dawn and dusk when the veils thinned. Rituals involving harmonic convergences of bells tolled in precise intervals calculated by Pythagorean ratios that resonated with the music of the spheres, bells cast in foundries at Cluny Abbey where Benedictine reforms emphasized communal prayer to synchronize human wills with divine harmony, and during one such patrol in the misty valleys of the Eifel region, where volcanic lakes bubbled with geothermal vapors reminiscent of Hades' entrances in classical lore, a warden encountered a rift manifestation, a swirling vortex of iridescent light that emitted sounds like a choir of seraphim mingled with the howls of Fenrir from Ragnarok prophecies, and stepping through in a trance induced by fasting and meditation, he emerged in a shadow realm where Charlemagne's spirit reigned as a luminous guardian, his form armored in ethereal plate mail glowing with the aura of his earthly victories over the Lombards at Pavia's besieged walls, where starvation had forced surrender after months of defiance, and the emperor's ghost revealed that the hive mind drew power from unresolved karmic debts. Debts accrued from the mass baptisms at Verdun where thousands of Saxons had been slain for refusing the faith, their blood staining the Aller River red like wine spilled at Eucharistic feasts, debts that echoed through timelines as quantum entanglements linking past atrocities to present maladies. And to sever these bonds, the Spirit instructed a grand atonement ceremony involving representatives from all conquered peoples, Saxons with their notched axes symbolizing Irminsul's fall, Lombards bearing the iron crown from Monza's treasury with its nail from Christ's cross, Avars with nomadic stirrups enabling cavalry charges that had terrorized Pannonia before Charlemagne's ring sieges yielded treasures wagons could scarcely haul, and even Moorish envoys from beyond the Pyrenees, clad in flowing jalabas embroidered with geometric patterns reflecting Alhambra's future splendors, invited under truce to recount grievances from the Roncesvalles ambush where Roland's horn had summoned no aid against Basque guile, and assembling at Aachen chapel on the anniversary of Charlemagne's death, under a canopy of stars where comets like Halley's had streaked as omens during his coronation in 800, the ceremony unfolded with offerings of peace, swords beaten into plowshares as per Isaiah's prophecy, forged in the palace smithy amid sparks flying like shooting stars, distributed to farmers tilling fields once battlegrounds. And as incantations rose in a polyglot chorus of Latin, Old High German, Vulgar Romance, and Arabic surahs invoking mercy, the rift sealed with a thunderclap that shook the foundations, banishing the hive to oblivion's fringes, yet not without a final surge that afflicted Charles the Bald, Louis's youngest, with a fleeting vision of future schisms, the Treaty of Verdun in 843 carving the empire into west, Middle, and East Francia, precursors to France, Italy, and Germany. Schisms that sowed seeds for medieval feuds but also cultural fluorescences in Romanesque art and chivalric codes, and with the immediate threat abetted. Louis reflected in his twilight years, penning treatises on governance infused with mystical insights, treatises copied in vellum codices bound with ivory plaques carved with scenes of cosmic harmony, leaving a legacy where history and myth entwined like the double helix of fate's design, a design that hinted at eternal recurrences in the wheel of time, where enigmas reborn awaited solvers in epics unborn. And as this eighth part culminates on that cyclical vista, the Chronicles void summon. Plunge into profundities unbound in the sequences forthcoming. The Chronicles void summon plunge into profundities unbound in the sequences forthcoming. As the Chronicles void summoned a plunge into profundities unbound that eclipsed the prior revelations in scope and intricacy. Drawing the saga of Charlemagne's heirs into abyssal dimensions where the fabric of reality unraveled like the frayed edges of ancient parchments preserved in the dusty vaults of monastic libraries scattered across the fragmented empire. Libraries like those at Fulda where Hieronymus Morris compiled his encyclopedic works blending sacred scripture with profane knowledge from Aristotle's lost treatises recovered through chains of translation from Greek to Syriac to Arabic in the luminous halls of Baghdad's House of Wisdom under the patronage of caliphs who gazed upon astrolabes charting the heavens' eternal dance, a dance that mirrored the swirling chaos now enveloping Louis the Pious' court in the tumultuous decade of the 830s, when the empire, once a monolithic edifice forged by his father's iron will through campaigns that subdued the fractious tribes from the Elba's marshy banks where Slavic Sorbs fished in reed canoes under willow canopies to the Ebro's arid valleys in Hispania, where Moorish irrigation channels watered almond groves blooming white under Andalusian suns, began to crack under the strains of filial rebellions ignited by the birth of Charles the Bald in 823 to Judith of Bavaria, a union that reshuffled the inheritance deck like a gambler in the bustling markets of Constantinople's hippodrome where charioteers raced for glory amid crowds cheering factions of blues and greens. Factions that symbolize deeper divisions much like the growing rifts among Lothair, Pepin, and Louis the German, each plotting in their sub-kingdoms. Lothair from the Italian plains of Pavia with its Roman brick basilicas echoing Lombard kings' ghosts, Pepin from the Garonne's winding courses through Gascon hills dotted with chateaux overlooking vineyards heavy with grapes destined for Bordeaux casks aged in oak barrels hewn from Pyrenean forests. And Louis the German from the Bavarian plateaus where alpine meadows rang with cowbells and monastic bells tolling matins. In abbeys like Tegernsee founded on lakeside shores reflecting snow-capped peaks, and these rebellions, fueled by maternal ambitions and vassal opportunism from counts like Bernard of Septimania who maneuvered in the shadows of the palace at Aachen with its thermal springs bubbling like cauldrons of fate, intersected with the multidimensional enigmas in ways that transcended mere politics. Manifesting as temporal anomalies where time loops ensnared key figures, causing days to repeat with subtle variations like echoes in the cavernous halls of the Palais des Papes and future Avignon, but here prefigured in the imperial residences at Thionville on the Moselle's banks where vineyards climbed terraced slopes yielding wines that tasted of destiny's bitterness, and Louis, haunted by these loops during councils where advisors debated the empire's fate amid maps unrolled on tables carved from walnut trees felled in the Odenwald forests teeming with wildlife hunted by royal parties with hounds, baying through underbrush thick with ferns and moss, experienced déjà vu that revealed glimpses of aborted timelines, one where Charlemagne abdicated early to avoid the curses, retreating to a hermitage in the Vosges mountains to contemplate the stars through crude telescopes fashioned from polished lenses ground by Jewish opticians in Mainz's ghettos protected by imperial charters granting freedoms in exchange for crafts like glassblowing that illuminated scriptoria with prismatic light, scattering rainbows over vellum pages inscribed with Carolingian minuscules revolutionizing literacy across the realm from the scriptoriums of Corbett where monks copied Cassiodorus's institutions to the classrooms of York where Alcuin's pupils had migrated back to teach Anglo-Saxon youths the arts of rhetoric and dialectic under thatched roofs leaking in Northumbrian rains. And in these temporal eddies, the poisons afflicting the heirs appeared as chronoviruses, infectious agents from future epochs leaking backward through wormholes punched in the space-time continuum by the hive mind's desperate bids to rewrite history, viruses that alter genetic legacies encoded in the bloodlines like the helical structures intuited by alchemists in their quest for the elixir vitae. Structures that would one day be unraveled by savants in distant laboratories, but here symbolized in the intertwined vines of illuminated initials and gospel books from the Ada school, where gold leaf from Nubian mines via Egyptian ports, gilded letters blooming with foliage representing the tree of knowledge whose fruits tempted with forbidden insights. And to combat these chronal incursions, the Order of the Veil Wardens expanded their mandate, recruiting temporal seers from the fringes of the empire. Shamans from the Lappish tundras where reindeer herders divined futures in auroral lights dancing green and purple across polar skies like veils parting to other worlds. Dervishes from the Anatolian steppes, whirling in Sufi trances that synchronized with cosmic rhythms under minarets piercing Cappadocian rock formations honeycombed with hermit cells echoing Byzantine chants. And even explorers from the Varangian routes down the Dnieper to the Black Sea where Rus traders bartered furs for Byzantine silks in Cherson's harbors bustling with galleys rowed by Slavic oarsmen chanting rhythms that evoked primordial seas. And arming these seers with chronomantic artifacts crafted in the forges of Metz, where master smiths hammered relics combining fragments of the Holy Lance from Charlemagne's treasury with meteoritic iron fallen in the Sahara and transported by Tuareg nomads across trans-Saharan trails guarded by oasis forts against Berber raiders. Artifacts like amuletic hourglasses filled with sands from the Hourglass Nebula's conceptual analogues, sands that flowed backward to reverse minor loops, allowing wardens to intervene in pivotal moments such as the assembly at Leisfeld in 833 where Lothair's forces compelled Louis to abdicate in a humiliating penance on the field, clad in sackcloth and ashes as bishops intoned psalms of contrition under tents flapping in winds carrying scents of nearby forests alive with game flushed by royal hunts halted by the crisis. An abdication that in one timeline persisted but in the warden's corrected strand was undone by the Battle of the Brothers in 834 where loyalists rallied at the Saône's confluence with the Rhône, rivers swelling with alpine melts that mirrored the flooding emotions of familial betrayal, and as wardens navigated these corrections, they uncovered the hive's nucleus. Not a singular hive but a fractal network of consciousnesses branching infinitely like the Mandelbrot sets prefigured in the geometric patterns of Celtic knotwork on high crosses from Iona's rocky shores where Columbus monks had evangelized Picts with gospels bound in sealskin covers resisting Atlantic sprays. A network drawing sustenance from quantum fluctuations where probabilities collapsed into realities based on observer effects amplified by the collective gaze of the empire's populace during feasts and fairs like the Lendit market near Paris where merchants hawked wares from Frankish linens dyed with woad from Picard fields to exotic spices from Malabar coasts via Arab dhows sailing the Indian Ocean's monsoons. And in these fluctuations, the Heirs' mysteries resolved into probability waves where poisonings occurred in superpositions, existing and not existing until measured by historical chroniclers like Nithard whose accounts of the strife blended fact with fable in Latin prose echoing Tacitus's Germania describing tribal customs that persisted in the empire's peripheries. Customs like the Thing assemblies of Scandinavian Thingsteads where free men debated under open skies ringed by standing stones akin to the Karnak alignments. And to stabilize these waves, Louis, reinstated but scarred, initiated a realm-wide observation ritual, mandating daily affirmations of unity in churches from the Cathedral of Cologne with its Roman foundations buried under Gothic aspirations to the Basilica of Santiago de Compostela where pilgrims trudged paths secured by Charlemagne's campaigns against Saracens. Paths lined with hostels offering bread and wine to weary travelers bearing staffs carved with scalloped shells symbolizing resurrection from temporal tombs, affirmations chanted in unison to collapse probabilities toward harmony. Yet disruptions persisted as Viking raids escalated, their longships beaching on estuarine sands like those at the mouth of the Charente where raiders sacked abbeys like saints, carrying off treasures that in alternate strands fueled alchemical transmutations into chrono-weapons, devices like temporal compasses pointing to divergence points. Compasses crafted from lodestones mined in Swedish fells and magnetized in rituals invoking Thor's hammer Mjolnir, hammer that smashed mountains as the raids smashed coastal defenses built with earthworks and palisades from local timbers felled by axes echoing the sounds of shipbuilding in Oslofjord yards where keels were laid from oak trunks floated down rivers swollen with meltwater, and countering these, the wardens allied with prophetic skalds from Icelandic Thingvellir, poets whose verses preserved oral histories of Yggdrasil's branches spanning realms from Asgard's halls of Valhalla where Einherjar feasted on Saramir's endless meat to Niflheim's icy voids where Hel ruled the dishonored dead, verses that wove protective spells combining with Christian litanies to seal breaches, and in a climactic convergence at the Council of Aachen in 836, where envoys from all faiths and dimensions gathered, Zoroastrian magi from Persian satrapies blending fire worship with Trinitarian echoes in their eternal flames guarded in temples atop ziggurats reminiscent of Babel's tower scattering tongues. Confucian scholars from Tang China via Silk Road emissaries bearing scrolls of I Ching hexagrams divining changes in imperial fortunes under emperors consulting oracle bones cracked in turtle shells heated over fires, and even hypothetical emissaries from Atlantean echoes and Platonic dialogues interpreted as lost continents whose crystal technologies powered thoughtforms manifesting as the hive's avatars. And there, amid deliberations in the chapel's octagon symbolizing eternity's eightfold path as in Buddhist mandalas filtered through Nestorian missionaries traversing Central Asian oases like Samarkand where Sogdian traders blended cultures and caravanserais offering camel milk and dates to weary pilgrims, a unified incantation was uttered. A polyphonic symphony combining Gregorian modes with Byzantine Isons and Vedic mantras chanted by hypothetical Brahmins from Indic courts where Rajas consulted astrologers charting nakshatras and palm leaf manuscripts preserved in temple libraries amid incense from sandalwood groves, an incantation that resonated through the multiverse, collapsing the hive into a singularity absorbed into the divine logos, freeing the heirs from lingering shadows though their earthly fates proceeded to the divisions of Meersen and Rybmont treaties carving realms into linguistic precursors of modern nations, a carving that echoed the saga's resolution yet left portals ajar for eternal vigilance, vigilance upheld by the Order's descendants in hidden enclaves through the ages. From medieval alchemists in Prague's Golden Lane brewing elixirs under Charles IV gaze to Renaissance humanists in Florence's academies debating Ficino's Platonic theology blending with quantum precursors in Hermes' Emerald Tablet, and thus the mystery, though quelled, whispered of recursions in the grand wheel where Charlemagne's legacy pulsed like a heartbeat in history's vein, a heartbeat syncing with the universe's rhythm and symphonies unbound. And as this ninth part seals its vast expanse on that resonant cadence, the tale's infinities call for dives into dimensions untold in the episodes ensuing.